Next, we take you to the campus of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Cambridge for a speech by linguistics professor Noam Chomsky. The event was hosted by the Thistle newspaper, an independent student publication at MIT. Professor Chomsky's remarks are titled Prospects for Democracy. The event lasts 3 hours.
Greetings. On behalf of everyone in the Alternative News Collective, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's talk by Professor Noam Chomsky on the prospects for democracy. First, I'd like to thank all the people from the alternative media who are here tonight to bring this talk to a crowd much larger than the people that are in this room, including the folks from C-SPAN who will be airing this talk a few days from today. And especially the people from local progressive radio shows, such as John Greeby from WMFO, the folks at No Censorship Radio at WMBR, Roger Leischner from Radio Free Maine, and the folks from South End Press who have a book table in the back. Before the lecture begins, a few members of the Thistle would like to tell you about the Alternative News Collective, what we do, and the gains that we've achieved over the last 7 years. My name is Steve Penn. In 1987, Rich Cowan, Gloria Lee, and I founded the Thistle. For the first 2 years, a collective of about a half a dozen of us operated the newspaper without an office, without any equipment, and without any funding. Each month, we produced the paper after hours, at night, in unused offices and lab facilities around campus, often beginning our work at midnight and finishing at dawn. Today, thanks to the hard work and abundant talent of scores of MIT progressive students, some of whom you'll hear from tonight, and many of whom are scattered across the audience and across the country, the Thistle has grown into a fortnightly newspaper providing MIT and the Cambridge communities consistent, hard-hitting, progressive journalism every 2 weeks during the school year. But the Alternative News Collective does more than just publish the Thistle. We also work hard in assisting other progressive groups at MIT and in the surrounding community in their efforts to have their voices heard. These efforts often take the form of special issues, such as the Be Glad issue, a special issue of the Thistle, which is entirely written and produced by members of Gamut, gays, lesbians, bisexuals, and friends at MIT to celebrate Be Glad, the Bisexual, Gay, and Lesbian Awareness Days. And by the way, the Be Glad issue is out tomorrow, and I suggest you all pick it up because it's one of the most interesting issues of the year. We also take an active role in many campus and community political campaigns, like opposing the Gulf War or fighting sexual harassment on campus. And we co-sponsor community events like this one, bringing community groups into the facilities of MIT and giving the MIT community a chance to hear many of the progressive voices in the community. But the Thistle also has a national effect. The Thistle is currently the largest radical student newspaper in the U.S. I should be happy to say that, but I'm not. The Thistle only comes out once every 2 weeks. We usually produce a 12-page issue. That's all we can manage right now, and we're the largest. Campus journalism faces increasingly difficult odds, and they need your support. Our counterparts on the right have a very large amount of support. The Madison Foundation is willing to fund and set up campus newspapers around the country. They started with radicals such as the Dartmouth Review, but it's spread. A few years ago, there were 30 such papers. Now there are more than 50. And in the meantime, radical student papers, which had a peak during the Gulf War, have now declined. Now there are a few dozen around the country. And it's not just the right. The increasing commercialization of college campuses have made it difficult for papers to start up because Budweiser is willing to fund student newspapers that drop thousands of issues on campuses. Students are deluged with information about Spuds MacKenzie and what eyeliner I should wear. They're deluged with information that means nothing about what's happening in the lives of people. The Thistle works only on the campus and in the community because that's all we can afford to do right now. But with your help, we'd like to make the investments and start the programs that have the effects of the Thistle go much farther than simple talks like this and the newspaper we put out every 2 weeks. To talk about some of the projects that we have put forth in the past few years is Jennifer Carson.
Hi, I want to welcome everyone here tonight. My name is Jennifer Carson, and I'm a member of the Alternative News Collective, which publishes The Thistle. I wanted to talk a little, as Steve said, about the other things that the collective does besides putting out the paper. A few times in the past, the collective has published a booklet called How to Fathom It, an MIT disorientation manual. The guide, which was distributed to incoming students, contained information on how MIT works from the corporation down, perspectives on different campus issues such as the military presence on campus. It contains student commentary on their experiences, such as what you might have to deal with as a gay or bisexual person at MIT, as well as a lot of information on different resources available at the Institute and which ones are best suited to different needs. Last academic year, one member of the collective published a book describing his experiences living at an MIT fraternity as part of a wider initiative to increase the amount of information available to incoming students about the Greek system. In an attempt to keep competing fraternities and sororities from, quote, bad-mouthing each other, the Institute places a lot of restrictions on what people can say during Russian Orientation Week. The effect is that incoming students only hear positive propaganda about the Greek system with no balance of information about negative experiences that people have had in fraternities and sororities. Many students do not have enough information to make a very important decision during their first week at MIT, whether to join the Greek system and where to live. The collective provided a place to disseminate information and gave incoming students the opportunity to make a more informed choice about where they live. In addition to these things that come from within the collective, every year we help other groups publish special issues of the paper. As Steve mentioned, this week is Be Glad Week at MIT, and the campus group Gamut is sponsoring a number of events during this week. Gamut, like many other groups on campus, does not have the resources to produce their own paper, and for the past few years, they have been able to produce a Be Glad issue by using the resources of the Thistle. So look for this issue tomorrow. It should be a good one. We also publish a pro-femina issue of the paper, which focuses on women's issues. The collective is an outlet for groups without many resources, with no space on campus or money or equipment to promote their issues and have their voices heard. For instance, during last spring, a Hispanic group started on campus, and they wanted to produce a newsletter, but they didn't have the resources to do so. They ended up being able to publish their newsletter with their upcoming events and some short articles of interest to the Hispanic community on one page of each issue of the Thistle. Also, over the past several years, many groups have formed on campus to help end harassment at MIT, to fight to change the procedures so that they're more effective, and to increase awareness of the problem of harassment on campus. One result of these efforts was the publication of a book called Fight Back, an underground guide to fighting sexual harassment. The Fight Back guide has been published twice, the second version containing more up-to-date information. And because the Institute is now in the process of implementing a lot of changes in the harassment policies and procedures, and it will probably continue to do so for the next few years, it would be beneficial to have a central place to update and publish new versions of the guide. Right now, that place does not exist, and the Thistle could provide such a space. Providing an outlet for left-wing groups to raise their issues is an important part of the mission of the collective, and there are two main reasons why we're not more effective in providing resources to these groups. The main one is that we just do not have enough equipment and resources ourselves. Right now, we don't have enough computers to lay out the paper, which means not only that it takes longer for us to produce an issue, but other groups are not able to use the computers to lay out their own newsletters or even a flyer announcing an event during any of the weeks of production, which is every other weekend. Another factor which decreases our effectiveness in communicating and working with other groups is that this communication requires that a member of the collective act as a liaison between the other group and the collective. One result of a lack of adequate resources is that the collective members spend a lot more time during the very basics of providing a newspaper, and an increase in resources would free up a lot of time for people to pursue and coordinate with other groups. Another important part of the collective's mission, which goes beyond the printing of the Thistle, is to sponsor progressive events on campus, such as this one. We receive calls all the time from both campus and community organizations who ask our help in sponsoring different events on campus. At this point, although we co-sponsor events with groups who only need a space on campus, we repeatedly turn down very worthwhile events because the organization asks us to provide some of the funds, even if the amount is small, for organizing the event. Also, we've been discussing the possibility recently of beginning a lecture series on different progressive issues, a project which would require a lot more capital than we presently have. By sponsoring our own speakers and co-sponsoring events with other organizations, the collective would like to help in making MIT a place where progressive voices are strong, where progressive issues are discussed, and where change is made. Frederick Douglass said, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress." We ask you to please help in continuing our struggle. The collective has won many battles in the past, and here to tell you about them is Archon Fung. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Archon. I'm also in the Thistle. I want everyone first to give a big hand to yourselves for coming to our fundraiser. A big hand to Steve Penn, who organized this event with his characteristic enthusiasm and energy. And most of all, to someone who over the years has given us his invaluable spiritual support, moral courage, and intellectual leadership, Professor Noam Chomsky. In an interview conducted over 20 years ago, Noam said that in the long run, a movement of the left has no chance of success and deserves none unless it develops an understanding of contemporary society and a vision of a future social order that is persuasive to a large majority of the population. Its goals and organizational forms must take shape through their active participation in political struggle and social reconstruction. I see the Thistle as exactly this kind of grassroots movement institution. We fight urgent short-term battles while attempting at the same time to articulate a long-run social vision in which human beings are more free and equal. Inside the newspaper, we are a collective. That means we try to organize the work which needs to be done in a way which frees the creative energies of everyone while preserving equality between all. Even inside our tiny group, this is not easy to satisfy the goals of efficiency, equality, and freedom at the same time. This vision of justice and work in society is not a new one. A form of it was dreamed by Rousseau in the 18th century, analyzed and attempted by utopian socialists and communists in the 19th century, implemented against all odds by anarchists in Spain and Russia during the early part of this century. In all cases, one might say that the dream of equality was crushed by those who were threatened by it, by those who had the guns or the money and didn't want to give up the benefits of being on top. Today, the flame of hope for reconciling freedom, equality, and efficiency burns dim indeed. Everywhere we look, injustice seems to have won the day. Our workplaces are organized according to principles of inequality, which end up putting men above women, white above black, and rich above poor. The university is subject to different rules, but those rules are no more favorable to equality than the hierarchy of the marketplace or the firm. A simple glance at the student body or faculty of MIT shows that the supposedly neutral criteria of academic merit reproduces the substantive inequalities of gender, race, and class, which rule the space outside the university. But there's little reason to think that there cannot be practical alternative organizational forms which are more just. As Noam said, it is the responsibility of the left to develop a visionary social order which is persuasive to people. If the vision doesn't work on at least a small scale, then no one is going to be won over by it. But the vision does work, at least in the Thistle. To be sure, the organization does experience its fits and starts, but we have grown yearly stronger since our inception 6 years ago. By and large, I think that we continue to demonstrate the viability of democratically organized work forms. Part of the vision which we are proud of and which we are asking you to support tonight is the remarkable fact that our organization can put out a regular newspaper while maintaining equality between and freedom of its members. But the point of the Thistle is not merely to serve as an example of successful democratic organization. We exist primarily to effect reform at MIT and the world. One philosophy behind the newspaper is that we are a persistent left-wing institution supporting a broad progressive agenda. Since we are not campaign or issue-oriented, we are positioned to respond to many kinds of political threat and seize opportunities to advance progressive principles whenever they arise. The Thistle was born in 1987 in the heady days of the South African anti-apartheid campaign, which was sweeping American universities. Students in the anti-apartheid movement at MIT found that the mainstream paper here would not publish their views or their articles, so they organized the Thistle. The Thistle and its founders went on to play a central role in the MIT anti-apartheid campaign by educating the student body, organizing demonstrations and disobedience, and pressuring the MIT Corporation to divest its investments from South Africa. In spite of supporting petitions and votes from the student body and the faculty, the corporation did not divest. Their refusal made plain to everyone the anti-democratic nature of MIT. And the recent history of South Africa suggests that we are right in our convictions, and the members of the corporation will have to live with the knowledge that they sided with the forces of racial oppression in that troubled country. In 1989, MIT President Paul Gray retired, and the institute was searching for a new head. The man who had been groomed for that slot was then Provost John M. Deutsch. Deutsch was a reactionary figure with influential ties in the Pentagon and the war industry. He worked on a 20th century version of the triangle trade, advocating Pentagon investments in such high-minded programs as biological weapons and fuel-air explosives. He also served on the board of directors of companies who profited from the weapons programs he promoted. In addition, he used his power as provost to pressure junior faculty to do research in areas such as the synergistic effects of combining chemical and biological weapons. Had he become president, MIT and the Pentagon establishment would have been even more tightly bound together than they are today. Deutsch had plenty of enemies, but to this day, we believe that it was the Thistle which tipped the scales against him. In one large expose issue in 1989, we revealed his research contracts, military and corporate connections to the MIT community. We showed that Deutsch spent more time and earned more money playing advisor for the war machine than being MIT's provost. The bad publicity gave his detractors useful information. John Deutsch was not appointed as MIT's president. Our research was also used to help knock him out as presidential contender at Johns Hopkins and Carnegie Mellon. Mr. Deutsch is today Assistant Secretary of Defense for Procurement. In 1991, Iraq invaded Kuwait, and the U.S. responded by killing several hundreds of thousands of Iraqis. The protest response in the United States was widespread, and at MIT, it began from within the ranks of the Thistle. We were the only broadly based progressive institution on campus, and thus it was natural for us to facilitate the development of the substantial anti-war movement on campus. We provided information and analysis of the war and its motives through the newspaper and visual media, sponsored events for the community, and organized marches and protests. When the crisis occurred, we were strong enough to respond quickly and massively at the local level. Unfortunately, the war was too short for us to affect its course directly. However, the protests which swept the country that grim winter were enough to persuade those who would wage wars in the future that they will not be able to maintain domestic political support for a protracted war of aggression in the years to come. Just last year, we played a part in forcing Dean Jim Tewey, ex-Dean Jim Tewey, of residence and campus activities to resign from MIT. This dean's responsibilities included handling sexual harassment cases between students and in his section. It turns out that a restraining order was filed against him by a woman with whom he had had an affair. In our judgment, a person with such personal liabilities was unlikely to be an effective adjudicator of sexual harassment or other discipline cases. So we wrote a front-page article which exposed the scandal. People in the administration had caught wind that the scandal was about to become public knowledge, and Tewey was pressured to resign the night before the issue hit the stands. In addition to these specific campaigns, a major part of our mission is to support other progressive groups and to forge links in a broad political coalition. To that end, every year we assist the gays, lesbians, and bisexual student group in the production of the Be Glad issue. Every year, this issue shocks and outrages homophobes and challenges the assumptions of sexual correctness in this hegemonically heterosexual society. In the past, we have also assisted women's groups at MIT and Wellesley in the production of their own newspapers, and we recently featured a special issue on Black History Month. These are some of the ways in which we at the Thistle try to combine the short-term imperative of political response to crisis with the long-term vision of creating a social order which is more free and equal, and therefore more just. Now I'd just like to say a few words of introduction to Noam Chomsky. Noam has not only fought for these same goals of freedom and equality tirelessly his entire life, he's inspired countless others to activism through the force of his example. I first met Noam when I was a sophomore at this institution in 1988, when I took his class, Intellectuals and Social Change. My classmates and I were exposed to ideas and facts which were so obviously true, but which had somehow escaped us until Noam and the other speakers he brought these facts to our attention. What eventually emerged from the analysis of distribution of wealth in America, the institution of the mass media, the bloody history of U.S. foreign policy in the world, was a damning critique of the society in which I lived. And like some religious revelation, life could not continue in the same way once I acknowledged the fact of such massive injustice. A frank acknowledgement of the state of the world demanded personal political action. And my experience is not unique. Fully 1/3 of the students in Noam's class that year now incorporate political activism as a major part of their lives. They say that great people are measured by the degree to which they change their times and the integrity with which they fight. Noam Chomsky certainly breaks the scales on both counts. He's changed our way of thinking about the conduct of the United States government in the world and at home. He has taught us how the media distorts the truth of events and how this distortion bolsters powerful interests in society. He has brought to our attention the countless tragedies which might have gone otherwise unnoticed by we in the rich Western world, such as the slaughter in East Timor. And he has forced us to look within ourselves to see the mark of complicity and urged us to do something to rectify that evil. His unwavering intellectual honesty, combined with tireless individual effort, shines out as an example of what one person can do to make the world a better place. Ladies and gentlemen, Noam Chomsky.
Okay. Properly wired up. You guys turn the thing on in the back. Got to make sure we're at MIT. Lots of wires sticking out. Begin with a few simple observations. The title, as you probably saw somewhere, is Prospects for Democracy. And to evaluate the prospects for democracy, we have to, first of all, carry out some kind of assessment of where the world is heading. That's the prospects part. And crucially, we have to decide what we mean by democracy, which is a term that is used in wide varieties of ways. If we look at the present scene, we find an apparent clash between doctrines that are widely and, in fact, proudly proclaimed and social and political realities that appear to conflict with them very sharply. The leading doctrine is that the wave of the future is democracy and markets, a future for which America is the gatekeeper and the model. I happen to be quoting from the New York Times, but if you sample almost at random, you'll hear the same thing, more or less the same words. That's the doctrine. The reality is that the world, including our own society, is moving towards a more autocratic and absolutist structure. The scope of the public arena is narrowing, and the opportunities for popular participation in it are also declining. In short, the realities are that democracy is under attack. There are also parallel attacks on free markets, and there are expanding forms of market distortion. It's an interesting topic, but not tonight's topic, so I'll put it aside and keep to the question of democracy, the other half of the story. Well, I said that the doctrine and the realities are apparently in conflict. That is, the doctrine that the wave of the future is democracy and we're the gatekeeper and the model, and the reality, which I think is rather the opposite. Also, there's at least an apparent conflict, but in fact the conflict can be resolved, namely by attenuating the concept of democracy and reducing it to pretty much an empty shell, to various forms with little meaning. And I think that that's exactly what is happening. Of course, in that case, the doctrine will be true, and I think if we look, that's pretty much what we see. The same is true of the talk about markets, but again, I'll put that aside. Well, the currently prevailing concepts of democracy, which have been narrowing and becoming more restricted and impoverished over the years, democracy and liberty as well, these concepts would, I think, have utterly appalled someone like, say, Thomas Jefferson and other great figures of classical liberalism, for whom, incidentally, democracy and even liberty were part of something broader. They were part of the conception of a good society which would be measured and evaluated by how well it freed individuals and their creative powers. It's to that end that democracy was considered an appropriate means. If we turn to a more modern period, I think that the currently prevailing and increasingly narrowing concepts of democracy would also have appalled contemporary thinkers, 20th century thinkers. For example, a crucial example is John Dewey, who was the greatest American social philosopher and whose thought focused primarily on the problem of enriching democracy, which he understood pretty much in the classical sense. He incidentally was appalled by the narrowing of the scope of meaningful democracy, both in practice and in the rising democratic theories of his era, mainly the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, the Wilsonian intellectuals who developed the progressive intellectuals of the Wilsonian period, who laid pretty much the basis for the modern form of the impoverishment and attenuation of democratic theory, helped out by the then rising fields of the academic political sciences. There's little doubt in my mind that Dewey, like Thomas Jefferson, would find today's scene, half-century later, even more ominous and depressing. Well, these are pretty important issues in contemporary intellectual history, and they have very broad implications, and there's a reality beneath them that is even more portentous. These are very large topics. They're actually topics for an ongoing seminar, not for a talk. I'll try to say a few words about them, but they're going to be inadequate, I'm afraid. Well, to begin with, notice that just about every society calls itself, contemporary society, calls itself democratic. Actually, every contemporary society also calls itself egalitarian. The question is, equality of what? As is discussed in an interesting book by Harvard economist Amartya Sen that came out recently. So in our doctrinal system, we're supposed to insist upon equality of opportunities, one particular form of equality. Others call for other forms of equality. I stress our ideology. The reality is something else, as usual. Take, say, the old Soviet Union. The old Soviet Union consisted of countries that were called people's democracies, and in fact described themselves as the highest form of democracy. Well, we laugh at that for good reasons, and it's useful to have a look at the reasons. It's not that they didn't have elections. In fact, they did have elections. They could have even made the elections free, in the sense that anybody who wanted to could say, I'm a candidate, and could even be listed on the ballot. Nothing significant would have changed. The reasons were several. The primary reason was that the basic decisions, the most important decisions about how the society worked, were not in the public arena at all. So it didn't matter much who voted and who ran. The basic decisions were made by a military bureaucratic elite, including crucially decisions over the economy, decisions over what was invested and what was produced, and how commercial interactions and so on. In fact, the basic decisions are at the core of any society, surely any modern society. They were out of the public arena entirely. And that had a lot of consequences. One consequence was that information was quite narrowly controlled by the very same hands, namely by those who had the resources and the power to impose decisions on how they were used. Now, side comment, the population of the Soviet Union apparently had very wide access to information and used that access. There were interesting studies done by American research, U.S. government-funded studies by American Russian research centers and others in the 1970s, who concluded that it appeared that about over three-quarters of the population was listening regularly to foreign broadcasts, and about 95% of the more or less educated sectors of the population. Samizdat, underground newspapers, technically illegal, but all over the place, they were read by about half of the relatively educated part of the population and by about 15% of blue-collar workers, according to these studies. Those are phenomenal figures for dissident literature, incomparably beyond anything that we can imagine. Returning to the reasons why we laugh at Soviet people's democracies, another was that there was very little in the way of popular organizations that were able to function in the political sphere. Public participation in proposing or crafting, formulating public policy was extremely slight, and there weren't any organizational structures around that enabled people to take part in it. And finally, most people were so busy just trying to survive that they were unable to participate in any meaningful way in the public arena and wouldn't have been able to even if opportunities had existed. Under such conditions, democracy is at best a very thin reed. Well, you'll have noticed, I'm sure, that I'm describing our society. The basic point, the crucial point about the concentration of resources and decision-making power is not quite the same as in the Soviet Union. Basic decision-making here, too, is out of the public arena, in fact, entirely out of it, almost. But it's not in the hands of a military bureaucratic elite. It's in the hands of private power, corporations, financial institutions, and the like, which operate in secret without any public scrutiny, virtually any, and essentially no public input. They're almost completely unaccountable, and in fact, they determine the basic things that happen in life. They are now increasingly transnational. As it's been the case over a long period that governing structures, things that become governments, tend to coalesce around concentrations of power in the last couple of centuries. That means primarily economic power. So national economies led to and were integrated with national governments. The increasing, the rapid escalation of transnational corporations, banking institutions, financial institutions, and so on. Around them, there is also coalescing a network of structures of governance. What the world's leading business newspaper, the London Financial Times, describes it as a de facto world government with its own institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, the new World Trade Organization, the GATT, the G7 the executive branches of the 7 rich countries. That's a kind of a framework of world government, what they call a de facto world government, that also operates very remotely, in secret, without scrutiny, without accountability. Its primary constituents are, in fact, precisely the transnational corporations and the financial institutions, and it reflects their interest. The new trade agreements, which is a rather misleading term in my opinion, but the trade agreements are accelerating this transfer of effective power to these absolutist, unaccountable institutions, now on a vast scale. Corporations themselves are absolutist institutions. Power lies in the hands of owners and managers. The only debate is about how that's how you divvy out the shares. Debate in literature about that. There's a fairly strict authority structure in a corporation. An individual can sometimes enter into the hierarchy, which means you essentially take orders from above and transfer orders down below. It's a fairly strict hierarchy, as much as any we know of in any institution. If you're an outsider, you're not part of it, you have basically nothing to say. You're allowed to rent yourself to it. That's called getting a job. You can buy what they sell if you like. You can watch. You can't see very much because they operate mostly in secret. And now that they're remote enough to be transnational and have their governing institutions in Brussels and Geneva and so on, they are even more operating in secret. Actually, this is all, well-known and old stuff. I was at about 10 years ago, I was at a conference in Switzerland on international affairs, and one of the participants was a Swiss diplomatic historian. In fact, he told me he was the Swiss diplomatic historian from the University of Geneva. We got kind of friendly, and we were out having a beer or something one night, and he told me that the worst job in the world is to be a Swiss diplomatic historian. And the reason for that is quite simple. Diplomatic historians are people who look at archival materials primarily. They try to figure out what's going on by looking at the archives. Well, in most countries, there's a sort of a buffer between private power, which basically rules, and policy. The buffer is called the government. And you can look at and governments do leave a kind of a paper trail. And we're pretty good in that respect by comparative standards. So, you wait 30, 35 years and sometimes even earlier, and you get some kind of a record, in fact, often quite an interesting and complete record of what the government was up to. But in Switzerland, they don't bother with the buffer. The corporations just rule straight. So they make the decisions, the banks and the transnationals and so on, and they don't leave corporations don't leave any paper trail at all. They are secret societies. They are secret absolutist organizations. If you learn anything about them, it's because, the multinational operations committee in Congress in the mid-'70s, under the pressure of the popular movements of the '60s, in fact, got subpoena power and released some information about them, and occasionally you find something out in other ways. But basically you learn nothing. So being a Swiss diplomatic historian without this kind of intervening level leaves you with not a lot to do, he was complaining. Well, we have something to do because there is this transmission belt, but the picture is, it's not all that different if you think about it. If you think about where power actually is, how decisions are made, and how much you can find out about the centers of power. Well, this has its consequences, naturally. For example, the other aspects of the deficiencies of democracy, I can't even use the word, I mean the absurdity of using the term democracy to refer to the Soviet system of tyranny. In various respects, we also have the same features. Information is very narrowly concentrated in pretty much the same hands as other decision-making. The major media are just huge corporations selling, people like you selling audiences to other businesses, to advertisers. And that sets the framework within which most of the rest operates. Actually, we have, it's a different information system and all sorts of different properties. One of the properties is that people here have much less access. They have access. They don't seek access to other sources of information. So the proportion of the population here that listens to foreign broadcasts is minuscule, and publications that are outside the very narrow and rigid ideological framework reach statistically insignificant part of the population, nothing like, say, Soviet Samizdat. There are reasons for that, and they're interesting ones, but again, that's another topic. With regard to popular organizations that permit the people to function in the political sphere, there's very limited. We don't have functioning political parties. We don't have political clubs. There's very little in that way, and furthermore, most people are indeed so busy trying to survive that even if such organizations existed, and even if information were readily available, there'd be a limited amount that they could do with it. And under such conditions, again, democracy is a fairly thin reed. I don't want to suggest that here it's like under Soviet tyranny, but some of the structural properties are quite similar and worth thinking about. These are the kinds of reasons why classical Democrats and libertarians were so hostile to corporate power. Now, they didn't really see it. They were on the classical period. I mean, people like Thomas Jefferson, they were only witnessing the very early incipient moments of what was going on, but enough to see it and not to like it. So Thomas Jefferson in 1816 expressed his fear that the country, I'm quoting him now, that the country was moving toward a single and splendid government of an aristocracy founded on banking institutions and moneyed in corporations. And if that tendency, which was just beginning, continued, he said, it would be the end of democracy and freedom. The few would be riding and ruling over the plundered plowman and the beggared yeomanry. Well, that was 1816. A decade later, period of Jacksonian democracy, Jefferson was a little more optimistic. Right before his death, in fact, I think hours before his death, he spoke at the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And in speaking there, he made a crucial distinction, which is worth paying careful attention to. He distinguished, I'll use his words, between those who fear and distrust the people and wish to draw all powers from them into the hands of the higher classes. It's one category. And the others are those who identify with the people, have confidence in them, cherish and consider them as the most honest and safe depository of the public interest, even though not the most wise. That's the second category of people. And he was hoping that the second category would be in the ascendancy. Well, looking now, that was 1826, it's clear, should be clear to any observer, that Thomas Jefferson's worst fears have been realized. Effective power is indeed in the hands of the higher classes. The early institutions of banking institutions and moneyed in corporations that he was concerned about are now vast in power and control and dominate the decision-making system, essentially in secret. And modern democratic theory, interestingly, is based on, has veered very sharply from Jeffersonian ideas, and in fact is precisely based on fear and distrust of the people, who must not be allowed to determine public policy or enter into the public arena because, as contemporary thinkers put it, they are too stupid and ignorant. They agree with Jefferson only on one point, that the people are perhaps not the most wise, but they disagree with them on everything else. And that's rather important. I'll return to that. Well, if we go back earlier, say half century earlier, to Adam Smith, he was describing a world that is very different from ours, so much so that the descriptions and the explanations really don't carry over very well, but the ideas do. He lived too early to see the autocratic structures of modern industrial capitalism, and he didn't anticipate their development. But he was already, at that period, very much opposed to joint stock companies, what we nowadays call corporations. And he was particularly opposed to them if, as he feared might happen, they would become personified and made permanent. That is, they would gain the status of immortal persons, in effect, with all the rights of persons except immortal. And that, in fact, is exactly what happened in the 19th century. If you look at one of the major parts of American 19th century history, is the creation of corporate power by government decision and the turning corporations, which used to be sort of public interest groups like Build a Bridge or something, into immortal persons with the rights of persons, which if you have corporate power means vast rights, well beyond any real person. That didn't happen through the democratic process. Actually, it happened primarily through judicial decision by lawyers and judges and so on, as part of the effort to create a developmental state, a powerful interventionist state that would introduce a high level of protectionism and direct public resources to private power, and in that way enable development to take place. Incidentally, that's the only way in history that development has ever taken place, from England up to South Korea and Taiwan, and there's some lessons there too. The prescriptions that contemporary economic ideologues, whatever you want to call them, offer to underdeveloped societies have the interesting property that they are refuted 100% of the time. If you can find one case in history of a society that's developed by those rules or even marginally using them, it'd be interesting to hear about it. Nobody's come up with one yet. There are cases of societies that have followed those rules, and they're mostly basket cases. Again, something worth looking at when you read primers on free trade and so on the front pages of the New York Times. Well, again, that's that other topic I'm not talking about. The judiciary in the 19th century did create the permanent, the immortal persons that Adam Smith was so concerned about. And again, his worst fears were realized. Adam Smith, though again, it's a very different world that he was describing, and the arguments don't, you could argue about whether they went through for his world, but they don't go through for ours. Nevertheless, the ideas are interesting, and the beliefs, and worth paying attention to. This is part of the system of classical liberal thought, the basis for modern libertarian theories of freedom and democracy. He held that markets could function properly only under conditions of relative equality. And he also thought, and gave a long argument to try to show, that liberty would lead to equality. Either to perfect liberty would lead either to absolute equality or to continual tendencies toward equality. And insofar as we don't attain that state of equality, or near equality, insofar as that's not realized, that simply indicates that we've not attained the state of liberty, of perfect liberty. Well, of course, the discrepancies are vast and growing, and that gives you a measure of how far we are from liberty in any sense that someone like Adam Smith would have recognized. He held, in fact, that only under conditions of relative equality and tendencies toward equality would market competition be efficient or fair, and thus able to contribute to its further ends. The market was no end in itself for people like Adam Smith. The further ends were realization of human capacities and potentialities, and a market could contribute to those ends insofar it was relatively equal, as the outcomes were relatively equal, and that he thought would happen under conditions of liberty. Otherwise, you don't have liberty. The very foundation of liberty in Adam Smith's view, and it's a standard Enlightenment thinking, is the right of every workman to the fruits of his own labor. That, he said, is sacred and inviolable. It's a crucial element in self-fulfillment, as another major classical liberal thinker, Wilhelm von Humboldt, who's very much inspired John Stuart Mill, as he put it, if a craftsman creates something beautiful, but does it on external command by the orders of someone else and under coercion, we may admire what he does, but we will despise what he is, because he's not human, he's a machine. Adam Smith held the same view. Coming to the present, John Dewey, who again was one of the increasingly lone voices speaking for democracy and freedom in the 20th century, 20th century America, though he was very much, surely, in the mainstream intellectual and political culture of his day, that's the first half of the 20th century, increasingly marginalized. By now his views are almost unrecognizable. He held, let me just read them, and I'm reading it because I think it's basically correct, incidentally. His views, and it should be a vision for the future, as it was a vision of the great libertarians of the past. He held that politics is the shadow in our society, politics is the shadow cast on society by big business. And as long as that is so, the attenuation of the shadow will not change the substance. In other words, reforms are basically pointless. The reason is that a democracy requires that the shadow of big business simply be removed so that the political system can function. The very institutions of private power, he stressed, undermine freedom and democracy. And he was very explicit about the anti-democratic power that he was talking about. Quote Dewey, it resides in control of the means of production, exchange, publicity, transportation, and communication. Whoever owns them rules the life of the country, even if under democratic forms, you know, acting within the shadow that big business casts. Business for private profit through private control of banking, land, industry, reinforced by command of the press, press agents, and other means of publicity and propaganda. That, he said, is the system of actual power, the source of coercion, and unless it's unraveled, we cannot seriously talk about democracy or freedom. Continuing in a free or democratic society, workers have to be masters of their own industrial fate. That's a classical liberal doctrine. Find it right through classical liberalism. Adam Smith, Humboldt, and the rest. Thomas Jefferson, of course. It is illiberal and immoral, Dewey said, to train children to work for the sake of the wage earned, not freely and intelligently, under their own control. Hence, industry must be changed if democracy is to exist. It must be changed from a feudalistic to a democratic social order. All of these are, or at least should be, truisms. And indeed, they were very common coin. They were common ideas among working people, uneducated working people, not all that long ago. Turn of the century, for example, when working people called for an end to what was standardly called wage slavery, which they regarded as not very different from chattel slavery. Well, I stress that all of this is as American as apple pie. It has nothing to do with Marxism, nothing to do with Leninism, or any of the other scare words that are conceived by the, concocted by the contemporary commissars. And it's all completely down the tube. As the system has become more feudalistic, in Dewey's sense, more fundamentally illiberal, and more opposed to the ideals of human freedom that were held, and indeed rightly held, by classical libertarians, those who we profess to honor, but in fact constantly kick in the face, and whose ideas are simply disappearing from sight. The doctrinal, as the system has itself become more feudalistic, absolutist, unaccountable, narrow, remote, secret, in essentially the classical liberal sense, running right up to Dewey and others of the time, as it's become narrower, the doctrinal system has also correspondingly become narrower. That's what universities are about, in fact, to narrow it and to exclude the thinking that, in fact, inspired classical liberalism and democratic action and thought. The fundamental libertarian principles, which, as I say, were even common coin among the general population, let alone libertarian thinkers, these now sound very exotic and extreme. I just gave you a sample of them. In fact, they're often called anti-American, an interesting term, actually, a term that can be used only in cultures with a really deep totalitarian strain. So, for example, in the Soviet Union, the worst crime was being anti-Soviet. And in the United States, people like professors at the University of Massachusetts publish books called The Anti-Americans, which people don't laugh about. You know, they're highly regarded, and you get sober reviews in the New York Times and so on and so forth. You might ask yourself, as a sort of a thought experiment, what would happen if somebody, say in Italy, were to publish a book called The Anti-Italians, you know, and imagine, or anti-Italianism, or, you know, anti-Norwegianism or something, and ask what the reaction would be on the streets of Milan or Oslo, or in fact any culture, any political culture that had not succumbed to totalitarian doctrine and still had a memory of what freedom and democracy were about. The very fact that we're able to use terms like that is quite striking, particularly if you consider our own history, of which I've just barely given a sample, but it's a real sample, not of major figures. Well, these are very important features of the deterioration of democracy in the current period, not only at the institutional level, but also in the doctrinal support for power that accompanies it. I ought to stress that this fear of democracy is a very old story and very deep-seated. Because the first modern democratic revolution was in England in the 17th century, and the popular democratic forces were bitterly condemned for seeking, as leading intellectuals of the day put it, for seeking to raise the rascal multitude against the men of best quality, and for making the people so curious and so arrogant that they will not submit to a civil rule. There was a civil war going on, as you learned in high school, between king and parliament, but what often isn't taught is that the rabble, the rascal multitude, were opposed to both sides in the Civil War. Their pamphlets said that they did not want to be ruled by king or parliament, rather, as they put it, by countrymen like ourselves that know our wants and know the people's sores. Incidentally, that same call was reiterated by rebellious farmers right here after the American Revolution, when they learned that they would continue to be ruled by the men of best quality, not by countrymen like themselves, as the revolutionary pamphlets had claimed. We're back to the distinction that Thomas Jefferson drew in 1826 that I quoted earlier. Actually, that's true of every social upheaval and revolution, at least to my knowledge. The official story is there are two sides fighting. The reality, quite typically, is that there are three sides. The two sides that are officially fighting one another for a share of the power, or all of it, and then the general population, which wants to be free of both of them, and quite often gets crushed. That, I think, if you look, is the real history of social upheaval and revolution, including the American Revolution, if you look closely. Well, over the time, the rabble have won rights. They've won rights through struggle. They're not gifts from above. The rights include, for example, the franchise, the right to vote. And that brought, which is expanded. So in the United States, half the population was disenfranchised until the 1920s, for example, but it finally won the vote. And in the 1960s, the vote extended effectively to black population, which hadn't really had it before. So these are all victories for democracy. It extends the franchise, extends something. And those victories brought with them renewed fears of the rascal multitude and new and more sophisticated devices to control and marginalize them. Now, as the power of the state to coerce gradually declined over the years, these modes of coercion and control and marginalization shifted more and more to propaganda. And propaganda is naturally in the hands of the powerful, not for surprising reasons. In our own business-run autocracies, that means primarily business propaganda, and that includes media propaganda, the media just being big businesses. And that's a huge phenomenon, some of it direct, like what comes out of the public relations industry in American creation, not surprising in a uniquely business-run society with a highly class-conscious business community that is always fighting a bitter class war and it knows it. So straight out of the public relations industry, and then out through its various outlets, including a good part of the media and the academic profession and so on. The leading student of 20th century of business propaganda, an Australian, Alex Carey, who's written very interesting things about the United States and is unknown here, he opened some of his work with the following comment, which I think is quite accurate. He says, the 20th century has been characterized by three developments of great political importance. The first is the growth of democracy. The second is the growth of corporate power. And the third is the growth of corporate propaganda as a means of protecting corporate power against democracy. Now, that's quite right. And that's, in fact, the new version of the methods of the fear of the rascal multitude and the methods of controlling them. And we see that if we look at recent American history. So start with, say, the First World War, which was important. The First World War taught quite important lessons in this regard. Woodrow Wilson created the first official government propaganda agency, the Creel Commission, designed to try to drive what was in fact a very pacifist country into war. He was particularly aided by the people who modestly called themselves the most intelligent members of the society, the liberal intellectuals, who took pride in the fact that for the first time in history, a population had been driven into war not by generals and other rotten people, but by the smart guys who perceived that it was the right thing to do. In fact, what they were doing was disseminating fabrications concocted by the British Ministry of Information about, Belgian babies with their arms ripped off and various other propaganda that was designed by the British, as they put it, to try to control the thought of the world. Well, the ones who they were most easily able to control were the most intelligent members of the society here, self-designated, namely the serious intellectuals who propounded all of this stuff with great sobriety and later took great credit for what they'd achieved. Whoever owns this is going to get a bit of silence. This was quite successful, this business propaganda, and it impressed people. Woodrow Wilson himself was called the great generalissimo of the propaganda, on the propaganda front, a phrase that was used by Harold Lasswell, one of the leading figures in contemporary political science, the founder of the modern field of communications and so on, who began a very influential career by studying wartime propaganda. The success of the Generalissimo was substantial, and it impressed several audiences. One audience that it impressed was the most important one, the American business community. It gave a big shot in the arm to the public relations industry. It had existed, but it really took off, very much influenced by the successes of the Generalissimo. In fact, the Generalissimo of corporate propaganda, Edward Bernays, who lived here, was part of the was in the Wilson propaganda agency, and he learned a lot from it. He developed the ideas, which he later propounded, which were that the essence of democracy is propaganda, what he sometimes called the engineering of consent. And it's quite obvious who's going to do the engineering, but though obvious, unsaid, because that's not one of the things you're supposed to say. Another person who was quite impressed by the successes of Anglo-American propaganda was Adolf Hitler. If you read Mein Kampf, you'll notice that he thinks Germany's defeat in the First World War was in large part due to the inability of autocratic, authoritarian Germany to compete on the propaganda front with the democratic societies, which really carried out thought control much more efficiently and effectively. He's actually quite right about that. And in Mein Kampf, he sort of promised next time around, they'd have their own propaganda agencies. Whether they succeeded equally to ours or not, is another question, but again, we'll put that one aside. A third audience that was deeply impressed were American intellectuals, people like Harold Lasswell, for example. They were not particularly cognizant of the fact that they were the main victims of the propaganda. That sort of was true, but you don't want to think that about yourself. Lasswell was the author, for example, of in the Encyclopedia of Social Sciences in 1933 or 34, he was the author of an important article called Propaganda. In those days, people were a little more honest. We don't use the term now. We use other terms, like journalism or something like that. But in those days, they were pretty straight. It was called propaganda. And he recognized that propaganda is necessary in any society, and more necessary in a society that's more free. The logic is sort of obvious. If you can control people with a whip, you don't really care all that much what they think. I think that's probably part of the reason why the Soviet Union wasn't very repressive with regard to, say, Samizdat and foreign broadcasts. They were to an extent, but nowhere near what they could have been, because it really didn't matter all that much. You got a bludgeon over people's heads. Here it matters a lot more what people think, so propaganda has to be far more sophisticated and much more intensive, as Lasswell and others realized. Propaganda, he wrote back in the 1930s, is a new technique of control of the general public, who are a threat because of what he called the ignorance and stupidity of the masses. And we must not, he said, succumb to democratic dogmatisms about men being the best judges of their own interests. We are the best judges. You'll recognize from the two alternatives that Jefferson counterposed in 1826. I won't reread them, but notice that Jefferson's worst fears became the credo of the modern liberal intellectuals. In fact, of the intellectual community rather generally. Bolshevism is a subcase of this. Not very different if you think it through. A fact which was long noted by libertarian, by anarchist thinkers, and in fact predicted by Bakunin long before the Bolshevik Revolution. He predicted that there'd be two forms of modern intellectuals, what he called the red bureaucracy, who would use popular struggles to try to take control of state power and institute the most vicious and ruthless dictatorships in history, and the other group who would see that there isn't going to be an access to power that way and would therefore become the servants of private power and state capitalist democracy, where they would, as Bakunin put it, beat the people with the people's stick. You know, talk about democracy, but beat the people with it. That's actually one of the few predictions in the social sciences that's come true, to my knowledge, and a pretty perceptive one. Well, that's the credo of 20th century intellectual life to quite a remarkable extent, and it shows how much we have declined since Jefferson's day. Jefferson was hoping that the alternative would turn out to be true. This is what did turn out to be true, his worst fears. This should be part of intellectual history in a free society. It's the kind of thing you ought to learn in elementary school. Jefferson's distinction applies with precision to the modern age, except everything has been reversed and forgotten. Well, this is also pretty standard in the academic culture. So, for example, the president of the American Political Science Association in 1934, Harold Gosnell, in his presidential address, advised, this is right in the period of the big ferment in the Depression, remember, you know, workers' struggles, everybody uprising. He said that we must, I'm quoting him, exclude the ignorant, the uninformed, and antisocial elements from the political arena. That's almost everybody, if you look at what he's talking about. What we need is an aristocracy. We need an aristocracy of intellect and character. The men of brains must seize the torch. You know, the action intellectuals of the Kennedy period, for example. Now, there's an unspoken assumption in all of this, unspoken and possibly unnoticed, since it's not nice to see yourself in a mirror. The unspoken assumption is that we can seize the torch, these guys can seize the torch insofar as they keep well within the shadow that's cast by big business that we call politics. If they move a little bit beyond that shadow or even to its margins, they forfeit their place within the aristocracy of intellect and character. Well, as I say, that's not much discussed, though an obvious truth. The leading thinker, the leading exponent of these doctrines, and one of the most influential ones, was Walter Lippman, who was the leading figure in American journalism for half a century, major commentator on foreign affairs, and also a highly regarded, called progressive political theorist. His view, he made a distinction between what he called the responsible men, very small number. He was, of course, one of them. Everyone who presents the views is always within the group of the men of best quality and, you know, the aristocracy of intellect and character and so on. So there's the responsible men on the one side, and then there's the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders, who are the population. Now, it's a democracy, so the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders have a role or a function, as he put it. Their function in a democracy is to be spectators, not participants. But they are allowed to, as he put it, lend their weight periodically to one or another member of the responsible men, the men of best quality. That's called an election. And then they're supposed to go home and, you know, watch the Super Bowl or whatever the equivalent was in the 1920s. Well, let me stress that I'm talking about the center. This is the liberal, pragmatic mainstream. The spectrum extends in both directions. Toward the more libertarian end, it extends in his day, for example, to John Dewey with his roots in classical liberalism. Toward the more reactionary end, it includes pretty much the mainstream business community, which has enormous fear of the rascal multitude and has its explicit political representatives, for example, say both in the political system and the ideological sphere, the Reaganites, the people who are funding those journals that Archon or somebody mentioned before. Their view is that the population shouldn't even be spectators. That's too much. They should be completely outside. That's one reason why the Reaganites were so committed to protecting an increasingly powerful state, because they were statist reactionaries. They believed in extremely powerful and interventionist state intervening in the economy and overseas, but it should also be protected. So they instituted unprecedented censorship. The first government propaganda agency since Wilson, this time illegal because laws had changed. They went for clandestine operations, big, as you know, huge clandestine operations, reached new peaks. Clandestine operations are operations undertaken targeting the domestic population. Everybody else knows about them. It's just the domestic population that doesn't. That's the respect in which they're clandestine. There are very interesting counterparts to this in corporate propaganda. I'll read you a couple of examples if you're interested. They're kind of interesting to look at, rather well crafted, but I'll put aside, time being tight. Well, that's basically the spectrum. At the libertarian end, you have extremists like Thomas Jefferson and Adam Smith and John Dewey. That end has been pretty much sawed off. On the rest of it is the spectrum lies between, say, the generalissimo of propaganda and his administration. That's kind of like the center, Lippman, Bernays, Lasswell, the concept of engineered consent and elite control. And then you go all the way off to the right, like, for example, the Reaganites, who don't think even the spectator role is too much. I mean, they're basically Stalinists, adapted to our political system. Well, the end of World War I, the generalissimo had some work to do. There was a lot of ferment. There was labor organizing, strikes, political thought, and so on. That had to be squashed. So the liberal Wilson administration conducted a very violent and repressive Red Scare with the support of the liberal press and so on. And that worked quite well. It led to a decade of quiescence and subordination to business control. And that's when these mainstream views of the Lippman, Lasswell type, Bernays type flourished. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, the quiescence broke. People became active again and thoughtful, entered the political arena, began to organize. Actually won some victories. In 1935, labor finally won the rights that European labor had won half a century before, namely the Wagner Act, the right to organize. Now that victory for working people and democracy sent a real chill through the business community. The National Association of Manufacturers, major business association, in its publications described the hazard facing industrialists in the newly realized political power of the masses and said this must be reversed. And their thinking directed to more proper channels, or we are definitely headed for adversity. And they indeed began a huge corporate propaganda offensive to block this incipient threat of democracy and human rights. The World War came along and put it on hold for a while, but right after the war it took off. Huge corporate propaganda offensives. That's one of the reasons why the United States is essentially off the spectrum of industrial societies on things like health and social contract and labor rights and so on. The right to organize was essentially destroyed by 1948, and by then the game was pretty much over. This was incidentally all pre-McCarthy. McCarthy was a kind of a latecomer. This was led by a spectrum of liberal Democrats attacking independent thought and people a little further over to the right undermining unions and social policy and so on. McCarthy sort of picked it up and turned it into something obscene, but was bad enough before, and essentially was all over by the late 40s. Well, the labor victories were reversed, and there was a major attack on independent thought. That led to the 50s, which were very quiescent, rather similar to the 1920s. Incidentally, there's been a recurrent pattern through American history. Democratizing tendencies, repression, and quiescence, and then things blow up again. At that time, there was a lot of new technology that helped, and that has a lot of bearing on the present day. So in the 1920s and the 1930s, radio was coming into existence. Radio, everybody recognized as a public resource. You know, it's not like shoes. There's a fixed band that's going to be government regulated. Everyone knew that. The question was, where will it go? Will radio be assigned to the public interest, meaning public radio, hence democratic to the extent that the society is democratic? You know, that's one option. The other option is just handed over to private absolute power and turned into a device for propaganda and profit-making by the private sector. Well, just about every country in the world, maybe everyone, I don't offhand know of an exception, went the first way towards making it a public resource. The United States went the second way, became a private monopoly, virtual monopoly. I mean, like a college radio station could have a, you know, little station that you could hear for 3 blocks away or something. But it was this issue was struggled about. Labor groups, church groups, other public interest groups sought to put the United States within the mainstream of Western society, and they lost. They lost flat out. That's a reflection of a lot of other things, the extent to which we are indeed an unusual society with a highly class-conscious business community, always fighting a vicious class war, and very well aware of it. These quotes that I read from the National Association of Manufacturers are quite typical. Okay, that was radio. By the time television came along, it wasn't even an issue. The world went one way, the United States went the other way. That's coming along right today. We're right in the middle of it with the question of this, you know, information highway business. Again, there's a question. Is it going to be a public interest resource serving a democratizing function, as the technology certainly allows? Or is it simply going to become another instrument of corporate power and corporate propaganda and thought control and concocting artificial wants and so on and so forth? And the answer to that depends on the balance of forces. The way things now stand, you can predict it's just going to be another instrument of thought control and corporate power, but it doesn't have to be. You know, these are questions of how people react. More other countries, not very different from us, in fact, very much like us, went the other way. With radio and television, and we could have too. It's a question of organizing and activism and awareness. One of the reasons for the intensive propaganda is to keep people from thinking about these things. To some extent it succeeded. Well, there was, the 50s were quiescent, very much like the 1920s. The 60s, it broke again, rather like the 1930s. There was a lot of ferment, and it aroused the usual fear. Ever since then, from the early 70s, there has been a major attempt to carry out another Red Scare case, essentially, to beat back the population to conformity and quiescence. It's kind of interesting that this time it hasn't worked. That's one of the, maybe the first time in American history where the cycle hasn't really worked out. A rather interesting phenomenon with a lot of consequences. Again, not much time to talk about it. But that's what we're right in the middle of. The new slogan in the early 70s is what was called by the liberals the crisis of democracy. As the chairman of the political science department over at Harvard put it, the Eaton professor of the science of government. I love that title. Speaking for the science of government, he deplored the crisis of democracy, the fact that societies were becoming ungovernable, essentially because the rabble was trying to enter the public arena, and that made it ungovernable. Unspoken in all of these discussions is that somebody is allowed into the public arena. Who? Well, not allowed to say that bad word. But the public are not allowed in. Well, Samuel Huntington almost gave it away. He kind of referred nostalgically to the Truman administration period when Truman, as he put it, had been able to govern the country with the help of a few Wall Street lawyers and financiers. Well, that kind of, you know, that's a little kind of on the vulgar Marxist side, and it wasn't quite that, but you get the idea, sort of had the general idea correct. And that, in those days, there was no crisis of democracy. That's exactly the way things were supposed to be, but now there's been a crisis, you know, women and blacks and young people and old people and farmers and all these bad types were trying to enter the public arena to press their demands, and that just made the society ungovernable. It had been fine under, you know, when you had a couple of Wall Street lawyers and financiers doing it. Well, that's the struggle we're right in the middle of. the efforts to restore passivity have been a mixed success, not completely by any means. We're right in the middle of it now, and the lines that are drawn are the usual ones, quite currently, in fact. Take, say, the NAFTA debate. It's very revealing in this respect. The NAFTA debate, the big issue toward the end of the NAFTA, NAFTA was a major issue for the corporate world. Such a major issue that the media, which usually kind of pretend to be above the struggle, abandoned the pretense, and their class commitments became very explicit. In fact, the New York Times actually used the phrase class lines at one point. That's like a no-no. You're not allowed to refer to that. But it was just too obvious to conceal, as were the commitments of the media. There was a real frenzy about NAFTA, unusual, in fact. And that tells you that something really important was at stake, as it was. A lot of what was important was the attack on democracy, in fact, which is accelerated by these so-called trade agreements. You recall right at the end, when it looked like not such a clear thing, the frenzy mounted to a fever pitch, and it focused on one thing primarily, the fact that labor, working people, were attempting to lobby their representatives. And that was considered an absolute scandal. Clinton made all kinds of speeches, which were headlined all over the place, in which he denounced what he called the naked pressure and the raw muscle of labor, which even descended to pleading based on friendship and threatening based on money and work and campaigns. Total outrage, to approach your representatives and say, look, we'd like you to do something. This went all the way over to what's considered the left in the media. So say take Anthony Lewis, who's about as far out as you can imagine and still be in respectable society. He denounced what he called the backward, unenlightened labor movement with its crude, threatening tactics and its fear of change and so on. The whole thing was real hysteria. And it was quite interesting. New York Times last day had an editorial which had in it a box in which they listed people in the New York area who were planning to vote against NAFTA, and they listed their contributions from labor. They said this is kind of ominous, raises serious questions about whether they're being honest and so on and so forth. Well, Washington Post did the same thing. That was interesting. Now, as everybody knew, but didn't say until afterwards, when they sort of came clean on it, in fact, they came clean the day after the vote, corporate lobbying was hugely greater than labor lobbying, by an overwhelming factor, as always. And nobody worried about that. They weren't having crude, threatening tactics and all this bad stuff. And there's a good reason for that. Corporate lobbying is not a problem. They are the men of best quality. They are the ones who are supposed to rule. And the responsible intellectuals are their good and loyal servants. So therefore, there's nothing to say about corporate lobbying. We don't object to it. It's when the rascal multitude tries to get in the act that everyone begins to foam at the mouth. They're supposed to submit in silence to the rule of the aristocracy of wealth, and of course the aristocracy of intellect and character, us smart guys who do their work for them. Actually, very little has changed since the 17th century. If you look at the hysteria in the 17th century, among 17th century intellectuals, which I just gave a couple of quotes from, I have a lot more elsewhere if you like, but it reads very similarly to the hysteria today. Say if working people dare, to lobby their representatives. And the reason it's the same is the issues are the same. You can call it a new world order if you like, but it's the same class war, and intellectuals are playing the same service role, the ones who are within the shadow cast by big business, that is, and therefore granted respectability. Departures from this do exist, but they're very slight. All of this helps to explain the enthusiasm for NAFTA and GATT, which the primary thing about them is that they vest far more power in private absolutist institutions, which are completely unaccountable to the public and operate in secret, spawning the de facto world government that the business press openly talks about. And all of that moves us toward, going back to that spectrum on democracy, this moves us toward the reactionary end, the Reaganite end, in which the population are not even spectators. Insofar as power is shifted to the transnational arena with its own de facto world government, you're not even a spectator, because only the most real experts and specialists have any idea, say, what's going on, in the IMF or something like that. Well, that's a great achievement in the destruction of democracy, and that helps explain the tremendous enthusiasm for NAFTA, GATT, and other such profoundly anti-democratic developments, also anti-market developments, but as I say, that's another story. Well, finally, just a couple of words on how this stuff works out at our dependencies. Sometimes it's described with considerable candor. Actually, one of the clearest voices these days is a former Reaganite insider, a man named Thomas Carruthers, who was part of the democracy enhancement programs, as they were called, within the State Department in the 1980s. These were hailed with great pride. That makes us, the beacon of the future and all that sort of business. He's written a book and a couple articles about this, and they're informative and honest, rather rueful. He says that the policies were sincere, but he thinks they failed. On the contrary, in my opinion, they succeeded quite brilliantly. But putting aside that judgment, what he describes is entirely accurate. It's just interesting to have it said from the inside, He points out that there was a correlation between democracy in the hemisphere and U.S. influence, namely a negative correlation. Where U.S. influence was least, the steps toward democracy were greatest, primarily in the southern cone of Latin America. Where, as he points out, speaking from the inside, the Reagan administration strongly opposed the moves towards democracy, tried to back the autocratic governments, which are in fact the residue of the Kennedy liberals, I should say, who were very close to the Reaganites in their picture of the world, remarkably close. The Reagan administration sought to preserve these kind of neo-Nazi states of the Southern Cone, but they failed, and there was a democracy. And then, of course, they took credit for what had happened afterwards. That, in fact, happened all over the place. Where U.S. influence was the greatest in Central America and the Caribbean, the effects were worst. He recognizes that, doesn't draw any conclusions from it, but in fact it's something that generalizes on human rights as well. Another one of those lessons you're not supposed to learn. He then points out what happened. Here's his description from the inside. Washington's, which he opposes, but he says, Washington sought only limited top-down forms of democratic change that did not risk upsetting the traditional structures of power with which the United States has long been allied. It sought to maintain the basic order of quite undemocratic societies because of the deep fear of populist-based change, with all its implications for upsetting established economic and political orders and heading off in a leftist direction. Well, what's a leftist direction? That's a direction that holds, to quote some leftist extremists, that holds that the mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs, nor a favored few booted and spurred, ready to ride them. It is the view that we should oppose a single and splendid government founded on banking institutions and moneyed in corporations. I'm quoting that leftist extremist Thomas Jefferson. In the early days of the corporate state capitalist absolutism that he despised and feared and that has come into existence. Well, Carruthers is quite correct. His picture of what happened is accurate, generalizes very broadly, applies at home as well. It's the key to understanding policy. Again, these are truths that would be taught in elementary school in a free society. Major efforts have to be made in the educational system, right up to the elite universities, to prevent people from seeing that 2 + 2 = 4, but that's the answer. It does. And it's not very hard to figure out. If you look not even very profoundly, you see it all over the place, and it's quite systematic. The policy is that the traditional structures of power must remain, and they have to be protected, in his words, from the populist-based changes. That's true abroad, and that's true at home. Democracy is a fine thing, but only if it has the right outcome. Democracy is defined not by process, but by outcome. The right guys have to win, otherwise it's not democracy. The right guys mean Thomas Jefferson's banking institutions and moneyed in corporations and their modern inheritors, and the aristocracy of intellect and character that serves them and labors to conceal the reality of the world from the rascal multitude. people like you if you get properly trained. I mean, you have to be willing to accept the training, of course. And if you do, a lot of privilege and power comes with that submission to power. So, you know, advantages. Well, we can see the Thomas Carothers thesis of the 1980s, which is just history, you know, it's just a chapter of history. We can see it right before our eyes today. In fact, it's playing itself out with really brilliant clarity right in front of us in Haiti. It couldn't be a clearer example. In Haiti, the United States made a mistake. We'd been supporting dictators and murderers and everything was all great, but there was a mistake. They allowed a free election. It was assumed that the U.S.-backed candidate, a World Bank official, would win easily, had all the resources and so on. But unknown to the men of best quality there and here, there had been a lot of ferment in Haiti. There's a lot of popular organizing. Big popular organizations had developed with nobody paying attention to them. They'd been very effective, and in fact, the wrong guy won with an overwhelming majority in the first free election in the history of the country, namely President Aristide, with 2/3 of the vote. Trouble is, it was the wrong 2/3 of the population. As it was described by America's Watch, the leading human rights group, he was swept into power by a remarkably advanced array of popular organizations that gave the vast majority of the population a share in local and national politics. Totally the wrong thing. Completely wrong from every point of view. Well, he was quickly overthrown by violence, and that was an end to Haiti's democracy, or as the New York Times put it in a headline right afterwards, Haiti's democracy such as it was. That contemptuous comment means not much, you know. We read regularly that President Aristide, and that just symbolically means the rabble that voted for him, President Aristide has meager democratic credentials. He is opposed by what the New York Times calls civil society, which fears that he supports class-based violence. He even blamed the rich for the poverty of the masses. It's an absolute outrage to tell the elementary truths in public here, maybe in secret somewhere, but, you know, not in public. That happens to be the New York Times, but, you know, it's standard. Again, pick at random, that's the story. So, therefore, Aristide must broaden his government. That's the current phrase. Unlike Clinton, say, you know, whose government is broad enough, just sort of take a look at the average income in his cabinet. So that's broad enough, but Aristide must broaden his cabinet. That's code word, which everyone understands. It means he must broaden his cabinet to exclude the huge mass of the population, because they don't belong there. And he must extend it to the democratic elements, what are called the moderates in the military and the business community. Power has to be shifted into their hands. Who are the moderates? Well, the moderates are the ones who don't think everyone should just be exterminated. That's why they're moderates. Rather, they think that people should be allowed to work for 14 cents an hour in U.S.-owned assembly plants, which incidentally is a very useful weapon against poor people at home and working people at home. It's a way to lower standards of living and wages throughout the world, and the rich society is an extremely important thing, so that's the moderates. Also, they're allowed to produce food for export. Right now, under Clinton, though I haven't seen any headlines about it, food exports from Haiti are increasing. This is a starving country, remember. Food exports are increasing, not by a small factor. They increased by a factor of 36 last year, you know, big number under Clinton, thanks to the liberal Democrats. That's fruits, nuts, citizens, melons from a starving island. That's for the benefit of U.S. agribusiness and yuppie markets. In fact, all trade with Haiti is increasing rather substantially under what is laughably called an embargo. The reason is because the embargo has an exception. It has an exception for U.S.-owned assembly plants. And when that's mentioned, it's always explained as a humanitarian gesture. You have to understand that Haitians suffer only when U.S.-owned plants don't export and import. When others don't export and import, they don't suffer. And also, like children in Cuba, fortunately, they don't suffer when they starve, so we don't have to worry about embargoes there. But we have to have a very carefully crafted embargo in Haiti, which excludes U.S.-owned assembly plants whose trade is increasing, in fact, total trade is increasing, which allows export of food, which doesn't happen to notice that the Dominican border is completely porous, so the rich can get anything they feel like. You know, the U.S. is totally impotent to stop the Dominican, control the Dominican army, which it runs, like, I mean, the United States is known for having been able to exert influence in places, but, not over superpower like the Dominican Republic, so we can't do anything about that. The Haitian military, as everyone knows, lives primarily on narco-trafficking. Take a look. Not a single, the U.S. Navy and Coast Guard have been able to pick up just about every fishing boat that escapes Haiti with some terrified refugees. That's a totally illegal blockade, incidentally. It's as if Libya, say, were to block all commercial air traffic out of the United States. But we're a terrorist state, so we do what we feel like. But we've been able to pick up every refugee, just about, but not a single narco-trafficking boat. That's amazing, isn't it? Actually, this was asked by the Black Caucus and John Conyers and others, and they got an answer. They said the problem in stopping narco-trafficking in Haiti is that the Haitian military, who we work with, still work with, don't have radar. So they can't pick up the planes and the boats. And of course, the U.S. Navy and Air Force, because of these terrible Pentagon budget cuts, they can't figure out a way to remedy this deficiency. So therefore, we just, what can we do? I mean, we'd like to stop it, but we can't. All this is going on. And the end result is perfectly predictable, and it was been predictable from the beginning. And for example, it was predictable when Warren Christopher, the Secretary of State, had his confirmation hearings. He was asked, if you looked at the small print, he was asked, what do you think about Haiti? New liberal Democrats coming in. And he said, well, we think that President Aristide definitely has a place in the final settlement, though we haven't quite determined yet what that place is. And with that ringing endorsement of democracy, the Clinton administration took over and has succeeded in harshening the policies of the Bush administration, which it attacked, including what I've just described. The end result is supposed to be that the government is to be broadened to include the moderates of the kind that I described. Aristide either doesn't get back at all or maybe gets back and has a kind of symbolic presence, which means that the population has a symbolic presence. Meanwhile, the population gets terrorized and intimidated. A year ago, when the Americans Watch report came out, they pointed out already, beginning of the Clinton term, that if this goes on, it won't matter much whether Aristide gets back or not. The popular organizations will have been decimated. People will be intimidated and terrified. And then you can even run a vote, like the way we're doing in El Salvador. And then it'll be fine. If you intimidate and demoralize people enough, if you crush them, if you eliminate any hope, if you make it clear to them that if they get out of line, they're going to be slaughtered, then you can even run an election. And all the, you'll get Anthony Lewis to talk about this romantic era, like Thomas Jefferson, as he did after we succeeded in doing precisely that in Nicaragua. That's called democracy, and we're now watching it play out before our eyes in the case of Haiti. Well, that formula that Carruthers described that's it. If after sufficient terror, intimidation, destruction of popular organizations, and so on, you can ensure that power stays in the hands of the right power groups, the ones linked up to U.S. corporations and banking institutions and the others who basically run this society, then that's democracy. And everybody's happy, and we praise ourselves for our glory. As I say, the same thing's going on in El Salvador right now. We saw it in Nicaragua. We're going to see it again. Has nothing to do with the Cold War. Zero. That was just a pretext for things that happened before and continue without change since. So what are the prospects for democracy? Well, again, that depends what we mean by democracy. If we mean what Thomas Jefferson hoped for, the prospects are gloomy and declining significantly. If we mean the official theory that's been taken over, that has in fact taken over our increasingly impoverished and authoritarian intellectual culture, believe that, well, then the prospects are just as grand as we're told every day by respectable authorities who sing odes to the New World Order, for which we, meaning they, are the gatekeepers and the model. Now that, of course, is not the whole story. The real prospects for authentic democracy depend on something else. They depend on how the people in the rich and the privileged societies learn some other lessons. For example, the lessons that are being taught right now by Mayans in Chiapas, Mexico. They're among the most impoverished and oppressed sectors in the continent, but unlike us, they retain a vibrant tradition of liberty and democracy, tradition that we've allowed to slip out of our hands or simply be stolen from us. And unless people in the rich here and in other rich and privileged societies, unless they can recapture and revitalize that tradition, the prospects for democracy are indeed dim. Thanks. Somebody's supposed to make a speech. Is that you? You want this?
Yeah. No, it's okay. I can just talk. Can y'all hear me without the speaker?
Why don't you take this? Oh, it does.
Oh, okay. Well, I just wanted to say that while we're taking questions, we're going to send around these buckets for a little bit more money. We asked for $5 when you came in, and there are about 600 people here, and we have about $1,500, and we wanted more like about $3,000 would be 600 times 5. So we're going to send around these buckets, and we would really, really appreciate more money. We need about $4,000 for a new printer. We've raised some money ourselves. We owe some money to the printer. So it'd be nice to have more money, and while Noam answers some questions for you, you can give money to the Belmont Springs buckets.
Okay. Are there mics? I see 2 mics, so if anybody wants to say anything, come to the mic. Why don't you come to the mic? It'd make a lot more sense, if you don't mind. Because then people can hear you, otherwise they won't hear.
Okay, if you say it's unnecessary, what?
If people are leaving, wouldn't mind doing it quietly, that would accelerate things a little bit.
Okay, why do totalitarian societies still engage in propaganda if you say it's...
Pardon?
Why do totalitarian societies still engage in propaganda?
Oh, they do, yeah.
Why do
totalitarian societies engage in propaganda? They're afraid of their own populations. Take, say, Nazi Germany, you know, prototypical totalitarian society. It was very much afraid of its own population. It knew that it did not have much public support. In fact, part of the support for Nazi Germany came from the fact that there was a kind of social revolution, which was rather successful. You know, Hitler got them out of the Depression, and you know, things were happening, and they could get public support. On the other hand, they knew that it was a very thin thing. Actually, quite interesting in this respect are Albert Speer's memoirs, you know, Hitler's kind of minister of industry and all that sort of thing. He wrote his memoirs. They're very revealing in this respect, and I think they're accurate. What he pointed out is that unlike the democracies, Nazi Germany was never really able to mobilize fully during the Second World War. The democracies could become really totalitarian with wage and price controls and you know, command economies and everybody, you know, working double time and all that sort of thing. The reason was that England and the United States, people were really committed to the war. They were democratic, more or less democratic societies. People felt part of it, and they didn't have to be bought off. But Germany was totalitarian, and they had to be bought off. They had to be bought off in part by social policy and in part controlled by propaganda. Now, he claims that the inability to carry out real totalitarian mobilization in Germany set back the war effort by his estimate is about a year, which could well have been the difference between victory and defeat. If you look at the technology that was just coming into line in the last part of the war, including jet planes and V-2 rockets, Germans were way ahead of the West in technology. But part of it was propaganda. Now, if you go to the Soviet Union, I mean, the propaganda was crude, but it was there, and it was probably effective. You know, it's pretty hard to measure. They didn't take polls. But to the extent that there's any, you know, information about it from refugees and, you know, other sources, it's likely that a good deal of the population basically believed what they were being told. It's worth bearing in mind that, say, people like Solzhenitsyn, he was a pretty loyal Stalinist through, you know, his adult life. In fact, until he was punished himself. And that was not unusual. People believed what was going on, what they were being told, and there was some basis for it. You know, the worst propaganda, the craziest propaganda usually is based on something. So the fact of the matter is, for example, here, it's very common to talk about how the Soviet Union failed, the economy failed. There was this economic conflict between the West and the East, and the West won because capitalism's so great, and what's called socialism, meaning what was instituted after the Bolshevik counter-revolution, which destroyed socialism, that failed. Well, putting aside whatever you think about it, by what standards did it fail? You know, if you compare it with the West, sure, it doesn't look very good. But if you compare, say, the Cambridge elementary schools with MIT, and you ask how much quantum physics do they know in third grade and how much do they know here in graduate school, Cambridge elementary schools aren't going to look very good either. Now, that's an idiotic comparison, of course, totally idiotic, and nobody would make it, except everybody makes it. The whole intellectual spectrum makes it with regard to the failure of the Soviet Union. You want to know whether they failed or not. You want to know how the people felt about it. Ask about societies that were more or less similar to the Soviet Union when the experiment began, you know, when these two models began. Well, it wasn't Western Europe. You got to go back 600 years before Eastern and Western Europe are alike. In fact, Eastern Europe was a declining, deeply impoverished third world backwater run by the West up until basically the Bolshevik Revolution. So you want to make a comparison, take other parts of the third world that are more or less comparable. So say take Brazil and Russia, or take Guatemala and Bulgaria, and ask about those comparisons. Well, nobody in the West would make those comparisons for pretty obvious reasons if you know anything about Brazil and Guatemala and the rest of our third world. By those standards, the experiment looks very much like a success. And that's incidentally understood in the third world. It was also understood by American policymakers whose fear of Russia primarily was that it was succeeding. It was succeeding and it was offering a model for the third world. Well, people in Russia could see it too. You know, they could see that economic growth, which according to the OECD, you know, Western rich countries, was declining relative to the West until 1913, shot up relative to the West until about 1950, and then kind of leveled off and began to decline a bit in the 1960s, and of course went into free fall in 1989. They're now back where they were in 1913. Well, you know, people inside the country could see that in their lives. They could also see that poverty in absolute terms was remarkably low, well below economies at a comparable level in the West. I mean in absolute terms, you know, not relative terms. It's called the Gini coefficient, you know, the measurement of inequality, was far, even if you take in all the privileges of the nomenclatura and everyone else, still seems to have been far better than the West, and certainly incomparably better than Western ex-colonies, which had been like this part of the third world. Well, these are all things that people can see everywhere but the United States and Western Europe. There, we're much too educated to be able to see the wrong kind of truth. So everybody talks about, you know, they describe the comparison as if you were describing the Cambridge elementary schools and the MIT physics department. That's what's considered standard in the West. Try to find an exception. You can't find an exception virtually. Well, you know, it's another indication of how deeply brainwashed and indoctrinated we are. But going back to Soviet propaganda, it explains part of the reason why it was successful. I mean, people, you know, it's very crude. You could tell it's coming from the Ministry of Truth, you know, and easy to question it. I mean, but nevertheless, it was apparently fairly successful, partly because it was based on some realities, as is every kind of propaganda, including Nazi propaganda. And why do the countries continue using it? Well, they're afraid of their populations, and they are afraid of letting them get out of control. So you use every measure you can to control them. One of the measures is propaganda, but it just turns out to be more important in a freer society. It has to be disguised more and so on.
Yeah, I have a couple questions, a couple things I'd like you to comment on. One is the reparations we're asking for Cambodia for having stolen things from us after the war. The second thing is you mentioned some quotes about business propaganda. You said you could read a couple. I was interested in those.
Yeah.
And the other one is Christopher Simpson has a new book called Science of Coercion, which he had a little blurb on the back. And I wondered if you could tie that in with your commentary about journalism basically being propaganda.
I had something in my pocket, which I seem to have lost. Oh, here it is. Boy. So let me get that again. First was reparations from Cambodia. The second is the business propaganda. And the third was Chris Simpson's new book.
Yeah.
Which one are you talking about? The Splendid Blonde Beast?
No, the Science of Coercion.
The
Science of Coercion?
Yeah, the new one. I actually haven't read the new one, so I can't talk about it. So let me skip the third.
Okay,
I haven't had a chance to read it yet.
Fine.
Yeah. But he's very good. He's written a number of extremely good books. Reparations from Cambodia, I mean, that's just an atrocity, you know. I mean, in the first half of the 1970s, we wiped out that country. Nobody knows how awful it was because nobody cared. So, for example, the journalists, Western journalists, U.S. journalists in Phnom Penh, like Sidney Schanberg, who's known as the conscience of the press, they literally would not walk across the street, you know, from the fancy hotels to where maybe 1 million or 1.5 million refugees had flooded into Phnom Penh to try to escape what was then the heaviest bombing in history in inner Cambodia. And since nobody bothered to investigate, we really don't know much about the details. The CIA estimate, for what it's worth, is that during the first half of the decade, which is, you know, U.S. bombing and other things that went along with it, they estimate deaths about 600,000. Not all that different from Pol Pot, if you look. Furthermore, that created the Khmer Rouge, or at least contributed to it. They were nothing before the bombing, but they were able to mobilize, you know, as even U.S. government documents reveal. There's one independent governmental study of the atrocities in Cambodia. The government of Finland carried out an investigation, and the title of it is The Decade of the Genocide, 1970 to 1979. That's the decade of the genocide. They have 3 pages, I think, on the first half of the decade, because, as they point out, you know, very little is known since nobody wanted to look because it's the wrong story. And then they talk a lot about the second half, where everybody wanted to know the story because we can make a lot of points about it and pretend to be, you know, upset about the horrible things that are happening to Cambodians. Now, after this record, for us to call for reparations, I mean, it's like Nazi Germany asking for reparations from the Jews, something like that. Actually, the whole story about Vietnam is the same. If there's a more sordid story in history than our having provided guidelines for the Vietnamese to get back into the civilized world, if you can think up a more sordid story in history, I'd like to hear. Actually, I know one. It's sort of parallel. After Haiti won its independence in a slave revolt, France had just completely robbed and despoiled what was a very rich country along with the West. But there was finally a slave revolt, and they won the revolt after, you know, the country was practically devastated. France demanded reparations for the lands that were taken, and the whole West backed them up. The United States, Britain, everyone else. And in fact, Haiti was forced to pay reparations, which meant it just was totally unable to develop. Well, that's kind of comparable to what we're doing. I mean, the guys with the guns do what they feel like. You know, that's basically the story. On the business propaganda, I did bring one example, which is kind of an amusing one. It's from the Bradley Foundation, which is one of those foundations which, in fact, target one of those several major right-wing foundations that are kind of trying to stem this democratic upsurge. And they, in fact, particularly target the educational system. I suspect that they're the ones who fund a lot of these right-wing journals around. So here's the president of the Bradley Foundation, and it is, I suppose it was written for him by some PR agent or whatever, and it's rather cleverly done. The stuff is fun to read, you know, you can, and it confuses people. Actually, this came to me because a group of kind of progressive teachers and educators in Minnesota, in Wisconsin where this was given, were confused by it. You know, they knew they didn't like the conclusion. They didn't see what was wrong with the argument. And it's nicely done. I mean, I'll have to give a kind of caricature because you really have to read the whole thing, but here's the way it goes. And he starts off, or his public relations guy starts off with straight left-wing critique, you know, pulled right out of the movement literature. So it appeals to people who feel, you know, they don't like, it's kind of like the way rock music was taken over and, you know, commercialized and turned into an instrument of oppression and so on instead of, you know, liberation. Everything that happens naturally. That's what public relations is about. All right, so he starts off by giving a standard left-wing critique of the political system. He says that the way our system works, citizenship is an episodic, infrequent, boring duty. Once the citizen is voted, he's supposed to get out of the way and let the experts take over. Small wonder that Americans feel profoundly alienated and so on and so forth. You might guess that I consider citizenship as voting notion to be profoundly shallow and impoverished understanding of that activity. And, you know, all this goes on like this, you know, standard rap. Then comes the bottom line. He says, well, we shouldn't have just this impoverished notion. We should recognize that there's a lot more to citizenship than just showing up every once in a while to push a button. We have to turn to civil society, which is a far more expansive field for human endeavor than the political sphere. And then he talks about what civil society is. Civil society is holding a job, earning a living, spending time with your families, being a concerned parent in schools, going to church, playing golf, the whole range of activities we talk about and we refer to as voluntarism. And he says, every time we attend church, go to a PTA meeting, help a charity drive, or perform faithfully and well a task at work, we are being decent citizens. That's real citizenship, not just this business of pushing a lever every once in a while, this impoverished business. Well, what's the conclusion? Well, he doesn't draw it, but if you think, the conclusion is exactly what he deplored. Namely, once the citizen is voted, he's supposed to get out of the way and let somebody else take over. Well, who's that somebody else? So in other words, citizenship does not include getting involved in the political arena. You know, it doesn't involve getting, it doesn't involve, say, participating in designing legislation or pressing for legislation or doing anything else in the political arena. That's for somebody else. Who? Well, we don't hear a lot about that. We hear a little about it. Who takes over after the citizen has given up on the political arena and has moved to the PTA meeting, so he's a decent citizen? Who takes over at that point? Well, the only mention is arrogant elites, paternalistic social scientists and therapists who call for government programs, who call on big government to run our lives, corrupt intellectual and cultural elites in the universities and the media. That's all. They're the people who run the government. They're the ones who influence what the government does. They make the big decisions about what's invested and what's produced and, you know, what happens in state policy and so on. It's all being done, you know, by literary theorists from Duke or something. That's what it is. Well, of course, there's something missing, you know. What's missing? Yeah, what's missing is anything that counts. What's missing is the whole center of actual power. They're unmentioned, okay? Now, you know, when I read it like this, it sounds kind of crude, as if a 3-year-old could see it. But it goes on slowly. You know, the public relations industry doesn't spend a couple $2 billion a year for fun. They spend it so that you can do things in which you start with, you know, libertarian left critique of meaningless and oppressive institutions, and then you end up giving them more power. You know, that's the way it's supposed to work. And this is a perfect example. Corporate propaganda is like this all the time. You take a look at what's going on about the health program or about, take say welfare. The next big issue is going to be welfare. We got this big problem in the country. We have all these entitlements. You know, it's just a huge burden. It's like the ungovernability of the society. So, you know, there's all these welfare mothers with Cadillacs and all that kind of stuff. That's a really big problem. And in fact, if you look at what people believe, that's what they believe. So, for example, when people are asked what's the biggest item on the federal budget, believe it or not, the big plurality says foreign aid, which is just undetectable. I mean, first of all, we have one of the most miserly programs in the world. And what even that tiny program is export promotion. You know, it's aid from the American taxpayer to American businesses by which somebody might gain something. And it barely exists. Biggest item listed is welfare. People vastly exaggerate the amount of welfare that goes like to, black mothers with children and stuff. Well, that's the real biggest item. The Pentagon, only a quarter of the population knows that. And most of them don't know that that's a welfare system. I mean, the Pentagon is primarily a welfare system for the rich. In fact, for people like us, exactly like us, people at MIT, and in fact, high technology industry generally. That's big public subsidies, funneled through the Pentagon and, NASA and all this stuff, essentially to keep rich people happy. But nobody calls that a welfare system, of course. All right, now let's get to the real wealth. Let's just look at a narrow sense. Now there's going to be reform of wealth. Why do people believe these things? Well, they're inundated by it. It's what you hear all the time. So naturally you believe it. You're not going to carry out a research program. And you don't read Samizdat because we're not allowed to here. Now we're going to reform the welfare system. So Daniel Moynihan and all these good liberals are talking about how we have to reform it. Well, forget the Pentagon and NASA and the Department of Energy. Let's put that part of the welfare system aside, that huge component of it. Let's just look at entitlements, transfers to individuals. Well, they actually come in two types, which are equivalent economically. One type is you give $100 to a welfare mother. Another type is you take $100 off the taxes of someone else. That's the same thing. You could just equivalently not give the welfare mother $100, take $100 off her taxes. It comes out the same, obviously. Well, we have two welfare systems. One of them is the little piddling pennies that go to as entitlements. The other is a whole set of fiscal measures which give you various kinds of tax abatements and that sort of thing. Now, you look what they go for. Say, take home mortgage loans. You get tax off for home mortgage loans. About 80% of the funds on that go to people with incomes over $50,000. And as you get up richer, of course, it's more because they're the ones with the big mortgages. Take, say, business expenses. Well, we don't have to go into that. Take, say, charitable contributions. Well, it's the rich. They're the ones who get the tax-deductible contributions. Well, look, you might say, gosh, we have to have charity after all. Boston Symphony Orchestra and that sort of thing. But the point is, who should decide? Who should decide where charitable contributions should go? Should it be done through a democratic system? Or should we pay rich people to do it the way they feel like doing it? Well, we pick the second way. If you add up all this stuff, it's a huge welfare system. I mean, nobody's tried to calculate it as far as I know at all closely, but it's surely a huge welfare system. It probably dwarfs the entitlements, especially when you look at really regressive taxes like Social Security and so on. But nobody talks about that. That's not going to be reformed. That won't be discussed. Nobody will notice it. Nobody's aware of it. If you explain it to people, it's not that hard to understand, like it's not quantum physics, so it's easy to understand, but try to find some discussion of it. Well, that's corporate propaganda. Now, it's not, it's not coming out of the corporations. It's coming out of the media and the journals and the books and the courses and everything else. It's that part of corporate propaganda. And the most ludicrous beliefs become accepted, like the one I just mentioned. Or, for example, the comparison of Soviet economic development and Western economic development, which, as I say, is exactly on a par with comparing the Cambridge elementary schools to the MIT physics department. It's like that. Well, everybody accepts it because we're really deeply brainwashed. That's corporate propaganda.
Sir, I wonder if you'd sign an autograph for me?
Sure. Is it on the bottom of a check or? Sure. I got a pen. Any particular name or this one? Oh, okay. Yeah.
Thank you very much, sir.
It's strange. I mean, I feel a bit like I'm in a book by someone like Michel Foucault sitting here. You show us these things that terrify us, these things that horrify us, and the things that are terrifying are things we've created. And you've dug up discontinuities that shock us precisely because they exist where either we hadn't looked or where we thought we'd seen something very placid and progressive. But unlike someone like Foucault, you do seem to have a way out. But what I noticed was the way out took 5 minutes out of an hour talk. The ideas, the possibilities of transition and transformation seem to center on a fundamentally optimistic view of human individuals, that somehow we realize our natures most effectively when we're engaging in political practice and political discussion. But then, why is that really argued for from the shocking facts that you've built up to this from? Why is it not simply a supposition that can be sort of turned around when we look to the world and we see that, in fact, human beings seem very malleable and these processes seem very path-dependent in a world where, I mean...
I'd agree. I don't agree. I don't think that's what history tells us. I mean, for example, the Mayan Indians were not malleable, and nor were we. It's a very different country from what it was 30 years ago. A lot of things have been accomplished. I mean, take something that's happening right now. Warren Christopher's going to China. He's now in Australia. Actually, I was interviewed over Australian national radio last night. This happens all over the world, outside of one country, I should say. But they wanted to know why Clinton, wanted me to comment on why the Clinton administration is so adamant about human rights in China. Why are they making such a big fuss about human rights in China? It doesn't look to them like such a big deal. Well, that's the way the propaganda system works. We're supposed to believe that. In fact, what's happening is the exact opposite. The Clinton administration is seeking any possible way to get out of the congressional legislation that imposes human rights standards on aid. You find that, you look at the small print every day. Like yesterday, the head of the Human Rights Office in the State Department was pleading with the Chinese. He was telling them, look, we don't want any real reforms, just a pledge of reform, an indication that things are going in the right direction. Then we'll be able to sign the statement to Congress that says you guys are improving, and we'll be able to go ahead and, sell you nuclear generators and that kind of stuff. In fact, today, Christopher, you look at the paper today, you find Christopher announced that the legislation that bars high technology arms sales to China doesn't exclude GM, Hughes subsidiary of GM satellites. Well, that legislation is there because China was involved in missile and nuclear weapons proliferation, which he used for these things. But he said, well, it doesn't. They're having to cover it. All right, now, why is the Clinton administration forced to struggle? Why was the George Bush forced to go through all kind of elaborate pretenses and secrecy to send arms to his friend Saddam Hussein? Why did the Reagan administration every 6 months have to come out with horrendous lies about how the mass murderers it was supporting in Guatemala are getting better? And the Carter administration do exactly the same and so on. Why? Because of the 1960s. What happened is that the popular movements of the 1960s changed the country. And that sort of leaked into congressional offices where people wrote legislation, including people whose experience was in the 60s. One of the leading people in America's Watch, in fact, comes right out of that. 60s experience, off to congressional offices, writing legislation gets put forth. You end up having human rights conditions. And they're not totally without effect, They have effect. I mean, it's not just that every administration has to sort of try to sneak its way around them, as obviously they do. It actually has impact. It affects our friendliest dictators. They have to change a little bit. Well, those are successes.
They're successes. I mean, China has just been cracking down for the past 2 weeks.
Not like they would be otherwise. Not like they would be otherwise.
That may be.
Well, that's really important, I mean, the world is better than it was. And if you can make the world better than it was, great,
So what are the mechanisms that you actually see?
Well, the mechanisms are the ones I just described. I mean, there are a million mechanisms. Chiapas is one mechanism. What I just described is another mechanism. I mean, one path that a lot of young people took out of the 60s was the one I described. Creating human rights groups, pressuring Congress and so on and so forth. Another is like the Thistle. There's thousands of things, and they've changed the country. I mean, the people who were talking before were talking about things like, say, sexual harassment in colleges. Was that an issue 30 years ago? I mean, mention it, people would laugh. Well, it's an issue now. You don't laugh. That's change. It didn't happen because somebody gave a gift to anyone. It came out of a lot of struggle. The same, I mentioned the expansion of the franchise. I mean, the civil rights movement was a big success, not up here, but in the South. I mean, I went down not long ago to Hattiesburg, Mississippi, In the early 60s, that was like indescribable, terror state. That was it was better than Boston, the relations between blacks and whites were certainly better than Boston. That's a big change, Those victories are real. We live in a better society than we did before in a lot of ways. There are also things going the other direction, which I happen to be talking about, because we ought to be, instead of sitting around patting ourselves on the back for what we've done, we ought to be looking at what we haven't done. Now, if that gives the impression that you got to give up, that's just a mistake. That's sort of the impression that Foucault gives, I think. But a lot of things I don't like about what he said. But I think if you look back at what has been done, big changes. As I mentioned, there's been this regular cycle in American history of popular ferment and repression. And the last 20 years or so are the first time I can remember when the repression has not worked. It's been it's been huge effort that went into it. And it has left most of the population probably untouched. Things still go on, and there are a lot of opportunities. We have not thought much and have been kept from thinking about things which I think are very central, like democracy, like the traditional libertarian commitments of the society. That we've been kept from thinking about, but that doesn't have to stay off the agenda. So why be pessimistic, People are malleable, sure, under certain conditions. They also struggle very hard.
Will you have an opportunity to advise the Vietnamese government on how they might avoid the quote-unquote benefits of finally being integrated into the world economy and perhaps allowing them to be at once the fabled rotten apple?
Well, actually, one of Archon Fang's co-students in that class, he talked about an MIT graduate named Dara O'Rourke, has been what his way is, he went off to Southeast Asia, actually to Thailand, because he couldn't go to Vietnam, and he was working on, he's a mechanical engineering student, graduated here, and he's interested in sustainable development issues. He's working on Thailand with its real horrors, and he's now working on exactly that question. What would be reasonable plans for Vietnam to keep it from being totally despoiled and destroyed like like what is happening under the economic miracles? There are things that you can do. Actually, if you're interested, I'll put you in touch with him. You can take a look at his papers.
Well, yeah, I know you had been advising, or at least in contact with Vietnam back
no, I have not.
Early on in
Absolutely
the war.
Not.
Right,
I have no
maybe 20
contact.
years ago.
I have no contact and never had any contact with Vietnam because they wouldn't talk to me.
Right.
In fact, I'll just tell you a joke if you like. It's not a joke, it's real. With the South Vietnamese resistance, it was impossible to have contact. You couldn't get there, You'd be slaughtered by the American military forces. So the revolutionary forces of South Vietnam, which were the main target of the U.S. attack, it's another little secret you're not supposed to know, the contacts were extremely slim. You could occasionally meet somebody in Paris or something, but not real contacts. Such contacts as there were with North Vietnam.
Right.
But that was just an autocratic Stalinist society. And, they knew where we stood and we knew where they stood. I actually did visit once. And Pham Van Dong, who was the foreign minister, French-educated, cultivated guy, I went in, went to see him, and just, I suppose out of politeness, he had on his desk a French translation of my first book, which was mostly about Vietnam, American Power and the New Mandarins. So yeah, again, out of politeness, I asked him, what'd you think of that? And his answer in French was too anarchist. We understood each other. They don't want to hear from me about those things. If there's going to be, pressures, it'll come from other sources, like in other countries. But I think there certainly are things that they could do to avoid following the path of the Philippines and Thailand and Burma and so on.
Perhaps you should mail them a book or two.
No, I think they don't need it from me. They need it from people like Dara O'Rourke, who knows a lot more than I do and is doing it very well, as can other people. There are things you can do with an MIT training. It puts you into a position to give real substantive assistance to people.
Professor Chomsky, I found your lecture tonight very thought-provoking and very insightful in your criticisms of U.S. policy. And I'm wondering, what kind of an alternative proposal would you suggest to improve the current conception of democracy that we practice now?
We don't even have to invent it. I was sampling it from the absolute center of our tradition. As I said, that's as American as apple pie, what I was talking about, from Thomas Jefferson up to people like John Dewey. That's not very profound. It's pretty straightforward. If you think about it, you come to the same conclusions yourself. It was pretty well understood by a very large part of the working population not very long ago. The picture of what a democracy is reasonably clear. I think it's kind of the way I described. You can spell it out in much more detail. It certainly requires, exactly as everyone has always said, democratizing the system of decision-making over investment and production and commerce and everything else, eliminating the feudalist, absolutist character of that whole system. So the vision is not, the general ideas are clear. You can work out details. How do you get to it? Same way every other change in history has come about, by struggling for it, by organizing, by pressuring, by taking over institutions, by building alternative institutions. At some stage, maybe by revolutionary change. We're not there.
Could you suggest an alternative proposal for decentralizing the economic decision-making?
Sure, the kind of thing I was talking about. In fact, there's a lot of these things are worked out in tremendous detail. I think too much detail. I mean, there are elaborate discussions of how a decentralized economy could work. Take books like, another student in that same class, I guess not in Archon's class, but a couple of years earlier, was Michael Albert, who's now was one of the founders of South End Press and now Z Magazine, and was an economist. He went from MIT off to study economics, but he and a colleague, Robin Hannell, have written quite a lot about this topic, including a couple of books, with a lot of formulas and stuff from Princeton University Press and some more readable ones about participatory economics and how an economic system could work in detail. I mean, that's one model, maybe the right one, maybe not, but there's no, there's a lot of material around on these things. I'm not going to try to sketch it out now. It's not the place. But there's plenty of material around. The basic ideas are rather clear. They were clear to Thomas Jefferson. They were, despite the early period, the basic thinking was even clear to Adam Smith, if anybody paid attention. The way it works out in a modern industrial society is, of course, quite different. That's, the ideas to be applied, maybe changed, maybe developed. But I don't see the problem of finding a vision. It's all over our intellectual history, in major figures.
Okay, thank you.
Three more? Yeah.
There's several questions I have. The first one, I'll make them brief. The first one is, you talk about the positive aspects of rule by the people, but you also say that the people are manipulated by propaganda. In that case, do you think that if people are manipulated by propaganda, is democracy possible in that way? Also, in your opinion, what do you consider are reliable sources of journalism that provide information that's not, again, manipulated by business or moneyed sources, as you put it? The third question is your thoughts on the current situation in Israel and what's going on there, especially how it's been portrayed by many different journalists. And finally, about your perception of Ross Perot and basically the connection between, I believe there's a contradiction, because you had a movement of democracy going, people struggling, and actually a grassroots movement, but that was combined with moneyed source. So your opinion about that?
Yeah. Well, does the fact that people are manipulated mean that democracy is impossible? No, it just means they got to work to, any more than the fact that people are wage slaves means that wage slavery is necessary, or that people were once actual slaves proves that actual slavery is necessary. I mean, there's all kinds of oppression and controls and coercion and so on. You try to figure them out and fight against them. That's history. Obviously, people with power will try to coerce and control. It would be crazy if they didn't. In fact, they wouldn't have power any longer unless they did, so it's almost tautology. But whether one submits to that, that's another question. I mean, you're going to be taught certain things in school. You don't have to, you don't have to assume that it's true. You could find out. You have the intelligence to do it. You have the training to do it. And the same is true of everyone else. And they do a lot. So for example, much of the population is really not manipulated. You look at popular attitudes, you find quite consistently that educated people are the most indoctrinated. It's quite consistent, incidentally, not terribly surprising either, because they're the main targets of the propaganda system, and they're also the ones who, they're the commissars. They're supposed to internalize those beliefs and convey them to others, so they tend to believe them. But if you look at things, say, healthcare, I mean, ever since there have been polls taken, most of the population of the United States has been in favor of joining the civilized world. Having some sort of a national health care system like everybody else does, tax-based national health care system. Elites won't have it. They're off the spectrum. Or take, say, Vietnam. Educated, this is a big issue. This is like 35 years now. The general population, there's regular polls on it. The general population since about 1970 has been about 70%, on a free and an open question, so that's a high number for polls. About 70% have picked, among many options about the war, that the war is not a mistake, fundamentally wrong and immoral. There's nobody in intellectual circles who says that. I mean, statistically insignificant, The standard view, liberal to conservative, is it was, benevolent and sort of went awry. That's totally, the rest of the population who is not educated conceive perfectly well that that's nonsense. So a lot of the population is, in fact, not manipulated, but they're not organized, and that's where privileged people like us could make a difference. You can offer something that's very hard for people to do by themselves. So there's a lot of opportunities to overcome manipulation, and that's why there have been changes over the years. People refuse to accept lots of things that were rammed down their throat. Reliable sources, you just have to figure that out for yourself. I mean, there are lots of sources from different points of view. Everybody has a point of view. If you're honest,
in
you
your
make your
opinion.
Well, it's not just, look, you're an MIT student, okay? You're studying science, okay? Science is presented to you from a point of view. I mean, nobody teaches chemistry with no point of view. There are certain things you believe. Now, if you're honest, you make it clear what you believe.
But which sources of journalism do you rely on most heavily?
I read the New York Times, too. I mean, but you try to compensate for the distortion. First you have to understand where it's coming from, and then compensate for it. Like, let's say what I quoted about Christopher's confirmation hearing, which gave away what was going to happen in Haiti. It was actually in the New York Times in paragraph, 93 of some story on some other topic. Well, okay, that's part of the way you learn about the world, but then you should really look at other sources. There's quite a range of them. I mean, I can tell you what I write for, Z Magazine, which Mike Albert started, Lies of Our Times, other alternative journals. I'm not saying rely on those. You should, any more than you should rely on what I just told you the last couple of hours. I mean, if you're honest, you say, look, here's what I believe. You make it as clear as possible so everybody can understand where you're coming from and what your commitments are, and then they can evaluate. But you're the one who's going to have to evaluate.
Unfortunately, if you say that these sources of journalism are manipulated by big money, et cetera, then it's difficult to get accurate sources of information, and that makes it difficult for us not to be manipulated by this type of propaganda.
You're a scientist. You've studied science, right? Is it easy to figure out the way the world works? I mean, nobody's manipulating it, but it's hard to figure out how the world works, even if it's not manipulated. And when there is manipulation, of course, it's harder, and it's sort of obvious how to proceed. Try to identify the source of the bias and the nature of the bias, and try to compensate for it, and look for alternatives that are looking at things other ways. So read the labor press, read the foreign press, read the alternative media, read the Thistle. There are and don't believe it. It's like, I don't agree with everything that's written in the Thistle, but it's another way of looking at things. And that awakens your thinking, and then you can proceed on your own. But, to look for reliable sources would be as if you were to look for reliable sources in science. There aren't any. What you're taught in a good science curriculum is to question and to challenge and to see if it's right, and to find out where it's probably wrong, because it usually is. And when if you're talking about things like the way the world works, I mean, incomparably more so. It's not a complicated problem. To do it is hard, but how to do it is perfectly straightforward. You do it in every area. If you want me to say, look, this is a source where everything that's published there is true, believe it, there's no such thing. I don't believe anything. I don't believe things either that way. It's not even in physics.
But there's a problem when you're dealing with science and when you're dealing with world events that are occurring in other places that you can investigate, that you can't see.
You can. Yeah, they can, depending on how much you're interested in.
And then the only sources you have are these sources that are very biased sources.
Well, if
Again,
you
that's where
choose,
the problem
if you
occurs.
choose to have
Yeah.
only those sources, but don't tell me that you're so underprivileged that you can't do what people were doing under Stalinist tyranny, namely looking at alternative sources. You can. It's not that hard. You may not want to, but you can. I mean, you can find things like what I mentioned, say Z Magazine down on the newsstands. And that's easier than getting Samizdat in Russia. But people did it, and you can do it. People in Chiapas, Mexico are much less privileged than you, and they were able to get alternative sources. They didn't have to believe what the ruling party told them. Now, for us to claim, look, what can I do? I don't have the kind of wealth and privilege that the Mayan Indians have down in Chiapas. I mean, that's a joke. If we don't want to do it, okay, but not that we can't. Yeah, what about Ross Perot? First of all, I wouldn't call that a democratic movement. I mean, it's not to disparage the people who were caught up in it, but that was a highly manipulated, centralized movement of one super rich guy who managed to organize a lot of dissatisfied people, and rightly dissatisfied, in things that sometimes made sense and sometimes didn't, depending on his whims. That's not a model for democracy. In fact, that's a dangerous model. Although the forces that he was responding to are quite real. You can say the same about religious fundamentalist movements. I mean, they are also responding to people's real concerns and feelings, but not in constructive ways. Sometimes in constructive ways, very often not. So I wouldn't call that a model of democracy or anything to follow. About the Middle East, it's a big story, but maybe there'll be a meeting. It's kind of interesting that since the peace treaty in, so-called peace treaty in Oslo, that was September, there has not been a teach-in. There has not been a discussion, One was called here a couple of weeks ago. The snow took care of it. But, it's remarkable. I mean, here's this major event, no discussion, nothing what's in the press is ludicrous. What actually happened, it's too complicated to discuss, although you can read what I think in, say, Z Magazine if you like. But briefly what happened is that the world capitulated. The United States for 20 years had been following a completely rejectionist policy alone, a policy which granted no rights to the Palestinians alone. You look at the votes in the UN, it was like, 150 to 2 and that sort of thing year after year, United States and Israel. The United States blocked every possibility of a diplomatic settlement coming from every source. Finally, the world capitulated. This is a rejectionist settlement, offers Palestinians nothing. In fact, it just taking the last few days where the horrors, what was obvious began to happen, it didn't offer them security. You read the papers just today, yesterday, and so on. You'll see the big debate in Israel about whether it's worthwhile to keep, 1,000 or 1,500 paratroopers and so on in Hebron to protect Jewish settlers. Are they the ones who are threatened? The settlers in the army have been going on a rampage. In fact, the day before the Hebron massacre, take a look at the newspaper, the Boston Globe, the day before the Hebron massacre, and you will find that Israeli soldiers carried out a death squad killing. They were trying to get somebody in a house who they suspected on something, so they blew up the house and they killed everybody inside. Well, it's death squads. So who needs protection? Well, pretty obvious who needs protection, but nobody's talking about that. In fact, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, all these hotshots around here in Cambridge, it turns out they were running secret meetings on security, including led by a big Quaker dove, I should say, in the Boston area, professor at Harvard. And they were very proud. It was kept secret until after the agreements. Then it was publicized. We're very proud. Look how fantastic we are and how wonderful we are. The discussions were between the head of a guy from Israeli military intelligence and the Mossad, kind of CIA, and other people with intelligence and their PLO counterparts. What were they about? How to protect the security of Jews, of Israeli Jews, period. You know, that's the great humanitarianism that we're so proud of. I mean, the racism is mind-boggling, but that's traditional American rejectionism. You know, the U.S. simply sees, from the point of view of the United States, it's quite true, Palestinians simply have no rights. They contribute nothing to American power. Therefore, they have no rights. Very simple. You know, the world had a different view, and the world gave up. That's basically the answer. You're not going to read it in the American press. You can read it elsewhere. I mean, take, say, Israel. I just had an article in Haaretz, which is like the New York Times, you know, sort of the main newspaper in Israel, which shows a critique of the peace treaty from this point of view. A big article, you know. I mean, inconceivable that you could say that in the United States. Well, you know, it's not that the facts are so obscure. You can even find them discussed if you look. In fact, you can even dig them out of the papers. Like when you read in today's paper that the Israeli cabinet is debating whether it's worthwhile keeping 1,000 to 1,500 soldiers to protect the Hebron settlers, does it take a genius to figure out what that means after what's just happened? No, it doesn't take a genius. It simply requires, you know, thinking a little bit. And in fact, the same is true quite generally. Now, this isn't the whole story of the Middle East by any, you know, big complicated story, but it seems to me that's the essence of it.
If I've got this straight, today is International Women's Day, and it commemorates the first women's factory strike in the late 1800s, and it was...
The first, what? Factory?
Factory strike in the late 1800s. It was violently repressed. Now, I noticed in your speech, I don't remember hearing any women thinkers or women thinkers or any women at all. Do you see any unique hope, any unique role for women in restoring meaning to democracy for us?
Sure. I mean, like the feminist movement has always been right at the forefront of democratizing forces and has been right in our recent lifetimes. The feminist movement really, you know, grew enormously in the last 30s and has had the last 30 years had a tremendous impact. Yeah, there are all kind of people. I mean, it happens that among the people who are called the Founding Fathers, I mean, they're called the Founding Fathers because there were no women. You know, as I say, women, I didn't mention it, but women didn't get the franchise until the 1920s, 150 years. They were out of the system, you know. So naturally, when I'm quoting Thomas Jefferson, I didn't quote the women who were in the Constitutional Convention because there weren't any.
Okay.
Right now, MIT pays my paycheck, but I began my career here by spending the night in Jerome Wiesner's office protesting the Vietnam War, so I hope I have a lot of credibility here. Yeah. I work with the Boston area El Salvador Peace Accords Coalition, and I just wanted to draw people's attention to the fact that there is an election there on the 20th of March. Just before I left my desk, a fax came to me about further indications of massive fraud. 600,000 ballots that were printed have somehow disappeared. The election tribunal is switching people from one city to another on the registry, so when they show up to vote, they won't be on the lists. And yet still we're sending hundreds of people just from this area alone. Over 50 people are going to help monitor the elections, some officially, some in a partisan way to help protect people who are voting for the FML and Democratic Convergence ticket. My question is, we're asking everyone to contact their congresspeople and insist that they talk to the World Bank and the IMF and withhold funds until there's evidence of fair election in El Salvador, and that they withhold all the funds until after what we hope will be the runoff in April. Do you think that these efforts are in vain given the formidable forces that we are facing in terms of the amount of money they have and the amount of power?
Well, if you want to assess a guess, I mean, it's not, I don't think they're in vain, but I don't think they're going to succeed. That's a different thing. You know, a lot of efforts that don't succeed were far from being in vain. Like John Brown didn't succeed, but it wasn't in vain. I mean, it was important. You know, and in the case of El Salvador, we should just be careful not to be trapped in the propaganda system. It's true there's a lot of fraud. It's true there are death squad killings. It's perfectly true that the El Salvador government, with U.S. support, has completely torn to shreds the peace treaty that was the basis for the elections. Remember, two core elements of the peace treaty, core elements, from the UN monitored peace treaty, were first that the judiciary be dismantled because it was, it was just part of the death squad apparatus. Two, that the national police be dismantled because they're just a bunch of, U.S. trained killers, and that they be replaced by civilian police. Well, the judiciary hasn't been touched, and the national police has been changed. It's been expanded by 20%, meaning we're paying for it, and not a step has been taken towards an integrated civilian police. So yeah, there have been all this kind of stuff going on, but that's not the real, even if you could overcome all this, if you could have no fraud, no death squad killings, civilian police, perfect election, not anything stolen, it would still be a fraud. In fact, a total fraud, because there's no other possibility. I mean, after you spend 10 years, slaughtering people, destroying the popular organizations, killing the leaders, intimidating people so much that they're afraid to appear in ads. Here's something you could learn from the New York Times a couple of days ago, which actually had a story about it. You look in the, hidden in the story, turned out that the story was all about how, the left isn't doing well, what that shows, and so on and so forth. Yeah, you take a look down in like column 3. It turns out that Rubén Zamora, who's the candidate, cannot get people to appear in ads because they're terrified, They know what happens if you appear in an ad. Pretty soon you're going to have these U.S. trained killers on your neck, and you don't want that if you have children and stuff like that. I mean, after 10 years of that, you can't talk about an election. I don't care how fair it is, there's no elections, What you have is some indication of how courageous people are willing to withstand monstrous terror. And to some extent they are, but to a large extent they aren't. I mean, if I was in El Salvador, I might decide very much to vote for the death squad party, Arena. Because if you don't, it could get worse, And, people have to live, and they know what happens if you get out of line in U.S. dependencies. So to talk about an election altogether is a joke. I mean, that same thing happened in Nicaragua. The left was trapped into discussing things like, how much money did the CIA leak and all that kind of stuff. Who cares? You have to give them a penny. I mean, the election started by George Bush saying publicly and openly in November 1989 that unless you vote for our candidate, the terror will continue and the embargo will continue. So you got a free choice. Either vote for us or your children are going to get killed or going to starve. So now you got a free choice. I mean, who cares how much money they gave to the other side? I mean, it's a joke, I mean, if anything like that had happened in the Soviet sphere, we would talk about, the Nazis. That's us, the Nazis. And the left was trapped too. I mean, there are books about it. There's a rather good book, actually, by a good guy on the corruption of the election because of, funding the wrong party and so on. A good book, but beside the point. I mean, as I say, it could have been, once that statement was made, it's over, especially because everybody down there knows we're going to keep to it. And the same is true in El Salvador, the same is true in Guatemala, the same is true in Honduras. I mean, they have elections in Honduras. I mean, they've had like 3 elections, I think, and they're, more or less honest. I mean, probably not worse than Chicago. It doesn't make any difference. 80% of the population is traumatized. So poverty is getting worse, The options are extremely limited. I mean, it doesn't mean anything. I mean, it'll be like if they have an election in Haiti. I mean, you wait another, Aristide, his term is over in 2 years. You know what's going to happen? Well, you know what's going to happen. He's over in 2 years. You just got to hang out for a little bit longer. There'll be another election. Probably everybody will vote for the generals, Well, what do you expect them to do? I mean, people at some point have to survive. That's what we call a free election. So it's, to get back to your point, no, it's not in vain. I mean, it's helpful for people down there. Primarily, it ought to be educative for people here. You ought to learn what we're up to and what's going on and what it means and so on. And that can, in the long term, help a lot of people, not just down there. But participation in that, for the democratic forces there, that's very helpful. though they're not going to win. No way for them to win.
Hello, Professor Chomsky. I was having an intense discussion with a friend of mine, and he was telling me that he thinks that I and the rest of America are brainwashed into thinking we have freedom. And I was wondering, what's your perspective on this? And do you think the American government has some sort of structured, organized, traditional system by which they inculcate school children across America? And if so, could you provide some examples?
Do they have, I didn't get the last part.
Do they have some sort of structured system by which they inculcate American school children? And if so, could you provide
it's not the government. That's, you know, if you, I mean, MIT doesn't happen to train elementary school teachers, but if you've gone through an educational system and you've made it, meaning you conformed at the right places and you weren't too obstreperous and you got to the point where you could get a job, you're going to be indoctrinating. I mean, the government didn't tell you to do it. You know, we have all kinds of, first of all, the government isn't the source of power. The basic source of power is the corporate system, and they're the funders, you know. And they don't control everything down to the last detail, but they set pretty narrow constraints within which things function, and it ends up with, yeah, very extensive indoctrination from grade 1.
I really don't understand how that's done, because I was...
How it's done?
Yeah, because I went to a...
Well, try to go to an... I mean, take say John Dewey, who I discussed. His main concern through most of his life was the educational system. He was primarily a philosopher of education. He wanted to create a free educational system which would bring up children. What I was quoting from was some of his writings on education. He said, we don't want an educational system which is going to train children to be wage slaves, you know, to follow orders and to work for. We want them to be free. We want them to think for themselves. We want them to challenge the social order. We want them to create democracy in the sense he was describing. He worked for this for years. He finally realized that it's hopeless. It's hopeless because there is private power is far too strong to permit anything like this to happen. I mean, if it ever starts to happen in some deviant corner, it'll be cut off, you know, by funding, by pressures, by repression, by all sorts of means. Now, that's not to say you can do nothing. You can do a lot of things. In fact, I happened to go to a Dewey elementary school when I was a kid, and it was very instructive. You know, you did learn to think. And there are little fringes of things that worked. In fact, it probably had an effect on the whole educational system, kind of a mildly liberating effect. But if you try to go too far, you know, you will soon run into power which feels its rights infringed upon and will respond as it can. How much will it succeed? Well, that depends on how much people are willing to resist. But, you know, there's no bureau in Washington that decides on it. Mm-hmm. Though, like I said, they're a kind of a buffer between real power and policy.
Okay. Thank you.
Is this on?
Last one. Yeah, I think this is the last question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Actually, I disagree completely as far as education, because I feel like people are so confused in my generation because the education has been an indoctrination into the system. It's been okay.
I agree.
So we pushed the Native Americans over, and then the Boston Tea Party. And I mean, how many years did we study American history? Basically, you started off your lecture. So I believe that education, as well as the media, has been a socializing agent to make Americans ignorant.
I say exactly that.
No, right.
No question. But notice how it's changed. Like, take your example, the American Indians. When, I mean, I don't know, when I went to school, at least, you tell about yourself, it was cowboys and Indians. You know, there were a couple of hunter-gatherers wandering around, and, you know, the good guys came and sort of, you know, tried to civilize them, but they were so rotten we had to defend ourselves from them and that sort of thing. That's not the way it's taught now. It's changed.
Yeah,
and it's
that's
changed
good.
because of popular struggle. Changed because of the 60s. That changed it. I don't know if it got to your schooling, but it's certainly true today.
Right.
I mean, it's not that it's great, you know, it's not great, but it's a lot different from what it was 30 years ago.
You started off by saying democracy is under attack, and it seems that everyone who has stayed here obviously knows that there's a lot going on and a lot wrong. President Aristide, but it kind of upsets me to hear you talk hopelessly about Haiti, because I see Haiti is at the forefront of revolution. They have achieved democracy, and it seems Americans are unable to recognize the phenomenon of people power in another country because we don't recognize it here.
So Aristide, I don't know if you're aware of this, but he talked about to the United Nations 5 days before he was ousted, democracy on a world level. He talked about how if we stop trading weapons, because we are a war-driven economy, if we stop trading weapons for 15 days at 1.4 billion a day, we could eradicate world hunger for, you know, many, many decades. So of course that
part of the reason he was overthrown was for talking like that.
Right, right, right. That's very true, but there is a delegation speaking tomorrow in Somerville about Haiti, and it seems that we should be supporting any democratic movement that we know about. It's going to be at the Tufts Administration Building from 7 to 9, because democracy right there means, you know, a girl, Marie, for instance, was in a room underground, is fleeing every 2 nights. She's been raped, tortured, there are some people still trying to continue the movement.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, look, and I didn't mean to suggest that if it will be hopeless if we let it be hopeless.
Right.
I mean, if we go on the way we are, Haiti's going to be exporting food, Haitians will be tortured and raped and murdered, there's not going to be any embargo, and they'll kind of wait it out until you can get the moderates in power. But, you know, that's not a law of nature. That's a reflection of what people don't do here. Could change.
Right. Do you agree that education, media, and the government should all be restructured in order, you know, to like basically save humanity?
Oh, yeah. Radical.
Do you? Do you? Yeah, I think so too.
Radically,
I mean, my gosh.
That's what I've been talking about for the last couple hours. Yeah. I thought, you know.
Okay,
yeah.
so I hope everyone goes here and tells at least 5 people what they heard about today to spread this kind of awareness.
Thanks. Let's have one last.
What's that?
Well, why don't we just have the 2? Can we have 2 last questions?
Okay.
There's 2 people left.
I have the following question.
Whoever's running this show. Yeah. Can we have 2? Yeah. Will that work? Okay. Yeah.
How would you estimate the likelihood of United States unilateral military intervention in North Korea? Also, Kennan's article, The Sources of Soviet Conduct, sort of outlined the policy of containment in 1947. Have you seen a comparable article outlining the post-Cold War strategy?
Well, the Korean case is kind of interesting. And incidentally, here's a place where you can learn quite a lot from the mainstream press, in this case, the Wall Street Journal, which the business press often quite accurate. They had a good article yesterday. I mean, you know, you got to decode it, you know. But basically what it pointed out is what some of the really good Korean specialists like Bruce Cummings have been trying to say for a long time. The South Koreans, the article was about this curious phenomena of un-American, anti-Americanism in South Korea. You know, for some reason, despite all the wonderful things we do for them, there's a lot of anti-Americanism in South Korea. All right, you start looking through what the anti-Americanism is about. Turns out the South Koreans don't want to have a war in which they'll get wiped out, you know, and in which the U.S. is going to end up using nuclear weapons and so on. And that makes them anti-American because we're driving them in that direction. Funny reason for being anti-American. They don't believe a lot of the stuff about the North, which is coming out of Washington. The South Korean intelligence, for example, just doesn't believe it. And they have a different picture. Their picture, which is shared in most of the world, I should say, is that the North Koreans are pretty desperate. They're isolated, you know, the economy's collapsing, and they want to somehow figure out a way to be admitted into the general world. They want free trade zones, they want railroads to China, you know, they want all this kind of stuff. And their kind of crude way of doing it is to make some threats about nuclear weapons. So the rational response is not to go saber rattling and have, you know, have our nuclear weapons kind of like 2 inches away from them, but to move diplomatically to try to proceed with this, and that's what South Korea is calling for. Well, you know, the U.S. isn't doing it, but we could, and in that case, it could work. You know, you can't prove that it'll work. You never know, but it's likely. That's, I think, the primary issue in South Korea. And if you take, say, yesterday's Wall Street Journal and you read it with the proper translations, that's essentially what it says. Kennan, containment, you know, I wouldn't take that too seriously. Kennan, there's a lot of propaganda about that. I mean, Kennan's own view was that the Soviet Union posed no threat to Western Europe at all, no military threat. That was his view always. It was also the view of Eisenhower and, in fact, of top U.S. leaders in general. There's a ton of declassified material on this by now. There was, however, a question about how to get rid of the Soviet Union. That was crucial. In fact, Kennan's view is that it was necessary to do that since 1918. That's when he says the Cold War began. That's when the breach with the West was reached an element of finality, as he puts it in his. He's also a diplomatic historian. He's a big history of this, and that's what he says, and that's true. Soviet Union was part of the Third World, which tried to go on an independent path, and that's just not allowed. You know, doesn't matter if it's Grenada or if it's a sixth of the world. It's not allowed. So it's got to be driven back into the Third World. And the only question is how. Well, in the late 40s, there were kind of two models. One was containment, the other was rollback. Rollback was actually the official policy, and that is you sort of, you know, maybe even go to war if necessary. Kennan figured that's a dumb way to do it. We should do it by containment. You know, we're rich and powerful and so on. We'll put all sorts of constraints. Ultimately, they'll collapse from within, something like that. Well, you know, ultimately that happened. Not surprisingly, if you look at the balance of forces. Is there a contemporary version? Yeah, there's several. For example, there's the Clinton foreign policy is a contemporary version. It was just, actually, since it's late, I'll just give you a reference if you like. But I have an article about it in Z Magazine in, I guess, December. Anthony Lake, who's the intellectual in the administration, the National Security Advisor, he came out with a new updating of containment at the end of September, I think. And the policy is we have to go from containment to enlargement. Okay, that's the slogan. So up until now, we've been containing the threat to market democracy. So that's why we overthrew the parliamentary regime in Brazil and installed a bunch of neo-Nazi mass murderers. That's because we were containing the threat to democracy. If you're a well-indoctrinated intellectual, you believe that. But now that we've finished containing the threat to democracy in such ways, now we have to enlarge market democracies. So that's why we're trying to overthrow the government of Haiti, in effect, because we're enlarging market democracies. All right, that's the new principle, from containment to enlargement. And if, you know, what it means is we'll do what we feel like in the world, if we can get away with it. You know, that's the new doctrine. It was also the old doctrine. Yeah.
Professor Chomsky, I was wondering what you think about the Western policies in former Yugoslavia and what you think about the emerging type of democracies there. The emerging type of? Democracy.
Yeah. See any emerging type of democracies? I don't see any. I wish I did. In the former Yugoslavia, I mean, it's a big story, and I'm not going to try to say anything serious about it, but, I mean, what happened, kind of, is that after the, you know, under Tito, whatever you think about him, ethnic conflicts were, in fact, you know, dampened. I mean, the partisans that Tito, his group, were kind of multi-ethnic. And they instituted a sort of a multi-ethnic society. It wasn't a paradise by any means, but it wasn't like today. When that system fell apart, a lot of forces that had been around for a long time came forth, like the current Serbian government is basically the old Chetniks. They even call themselves that. You know, they were Nazi collaborators and so on and so forth. The current Croatian government partially has its roots in an even worse group, the Ustashi. Don't say they're the Ustashi, but they were real, you know, super Nazis. Well, these groups sort of came out of the corners, and there were some problems. The Yugoslavia was falling apart. I mean, the West had to decide what to do. Largely under German impetus, the West moved very quickly to recognize two breakaway countries, Slovenia and Croatia. Now, the Slovenia case was sort of, you could give an argument. Croatia was a very tricky question because recognition of Croatia has a big Serbian minority. First of all, there's class differences. Like the Serbians are, you know, like in Bosnia, they're mostly peasants. The Muslims are mostly urban. So there's big class differences that go all the way through. There's a big Serbian minority in Croatia. When Croatia seceded from the largely Serbian-dominated, you know, Yugoslavia, they considered themselves at serious risk. And in fact, their claims, you know, Serbian peasants in Croatia was, look, if they can secede from our country, we can secede from their country. Okay, that was combined with an invasion from Serbia. So that's the beginning. too fast. It was done too quick. Recognition was much too fast before these problems were looked at. And they were real problems. They're not non-problems. Bosnia, the United States kind of backed off. This was mainly German initiative, but the West went along. The United States had kind of, was sort of backed off. They left it to European initiative. When Bosnia-Herzegovina came along, it was also recognized, but much too precipitously, because no one was willing to do anything to defend it. That was obvious. And furthermore, there were also similar problems. There's it's kind of split. It's three big populations, and nothing was worked out about how they're going to, how their own view of matters will be dealt with. So that was a recipe for disaster. After the disaster came, Europe's main concern, and also the main U.S. concern, has been just to dampen the thing down, so it doesn't spread into, so the problem doesn't spread to Europe. And it does. I mean, Germany has, I don't know how many, I think 300,000, hundreds of thousands of refugees are already in Germany, not a lot elsewhere. And that's a big problem, and of course everyone's worried that conflicts in the Balkans might spread into a major war. It could be a war between Turkey and Greece. I mean, the Russians can get involved. It's a real powder keg. So basically everyone wants to calm it down. Nobody cares anything about justice or anything of that sort. That's a joke. What you want to do is sort of calm it down as much as possible in the hope that it doesn't spread to harm rich white guys next door. And now, probably the only way to calm it down with even a modicum of justice is to have more ground troops. I mean, they can, do something at least, like keep the fighting down a little bit, deliver some supplies and so on. Here, the Europeans and Canada and a lot of Asian countries have been willing to put in ground troops. The U.S. won't. The U.S. refuses to put in ground troops. It's only willing to bomb. Well, that's not going to do anybody any good. Actually, it's a good thing that the U.S. isn't putting in ground troops. We should be in favor of that. Not that ground troops aren't needed. They are needed. But the United States, and here's something we ought to recognize, is disqualified almost uniquely from any form of intervention. And the reason is quite simple. The United States has alone, as far as I know, alone in the world, has a military doctrine that makes it unacceptable for American military forces to face any risk whatsoever. So you saw this, it's not a joke. You saw it in Somalia. If some teenager kind of looks at you the wrong way, you call in the helicopter gunships. Well, that's just a recipe for disaster. It means the U.S. is disqualified from being involved in any action that involves civilians. Because, in any such situation, there's going to be problems and there will be conflict. And you need the kind of rules of engagement that the Canadians and the French and the Italians and the Pakistanis and everybody else follow. Namely, you just kind of, hold on, keep your weapons in your pocket, even if there's a threat, even if you're under, in Yugoslavia, the UN troops are under mortar attack and they don't shoot back. The U.S. would nuke the place if that happened, because we have a different doctrine and we're disqualified from any participation. So until we change our own country in significant ways, it's a good thing that there's no American troops there. However, troops are needed, right now, well, if you've been reading the papers, you know that there's the beginnings of a sort of extremely unjust and terrible ceasefire, but probably the best of possible alternatives, and it's being endangered by simply the lack of ground troops to enforce it. So that's where we are. Actually, you might ask the question, why the fuss about Yugoslavia? Why not, say, Angola? Angola, apparently it's worse. There's not a lot of reporting because nobody basically cares. It's kind of like Cambodia in the early 70s, but it looks worse. Sarajevo is bad. I think about 9,000 people have been killed there. Probably 25,000 people have been killed in Quito. That's worse. And so how come nobody cares about Angola and they're all upset about Yugoslavia? Is it because of our deep moral passions? No. It's because the fighting in Yugoslavia might harm the interests of rich white folk. Whereas if a lot of these savages slaughter each other in Angola, who cares? It doesn't harm us. Besides, Angola is the wrong story. In Angola, the guy who's doing most of the slaughtering happens to be our man. who's probably still being supported by South Africa and the U.S. through Zaire, for all we know. He's the guy who 10 years ago was a great freedom fighter and one of the heroes of the 20th century and so on. He lost an election and he went to war, and he's now, now they're slaughtering each other, mostly his forces. So that's completely the wrong story. On the other hand, if you can blame things on Serbian peasants, who are probably communists anyway, that's the right story. So there's a lot of reasons why there's a lot of anguish about the Balkans and no anguish about Angola. And we could give a long list of other cases, I should say. That's not to say that the Balkans is not a horror story. It is. But there aren't any very good ways out anymore, not that I can see at least.
Noam Chomsky has been a member of the faculty at MIT since 1955 as a professor of linguistics and modern language. Professor Chomsky has written publications on linguistics, philosophy, foreign policy,